In a secluded corner of Japan, a group of loud, thrill-seeking bikers makes a pit stop at a gas station nestled amidst misty mountains. They're used to intimidating everyone in their path, until they encounter a quiet, unassuming man in a weathered jacket, refueling a motorcycle that looks ancient. They have no idea that this man harbors secrets they're not prepared to face. The iron wolves roared into the secluded gas station just as the sun began to dip behind the rolling hills of the Japanese countryside. Their bikes, chromed and loud, growled like hungry beasts as they lined up in a row along the cracked asphalt. The station was small and unassuming, a lone beacon of light in the middle of a foggy, tree-lined stretch of highway. The gang's arrival shattered the tranquil air. Kenta, the leader of the group, swung his leg over his custom chopper with a practiced ease. His heavily tattooed arms flexed as he removed his helmet, revealing a sharp jawline and a smirk that screamed trouble. Behind him, the other gang members dismounted, their laughter and jeering filling the air as they stretched their legs. "What a dump," Kenta said, looking around with disdain. The station attendant, a wiry man in his 60s, kept his head low and quickly ducked back inside the small convenience store, clearly wanting no part in whatever was about to unfold. Continued content in the next message due to character limitations. Continuation of Chapter 1. "Do we have to stop here?" muttered Rio, a burly biker with a perpetually sour expression. "Place looks like it hasn't been cleaned since the Edo period." "Relax," Kenta replied, lighting a cigarette. "We're just stretching our legs. Maybe we'll have some fun while we're here." It was then that the gang noticed the lone man by the pump. He was dressed plainly in a weathered jacket and jeans, a stark contrast to their leather-clad bravado. His motorcycle, a vintage Japanese model, looked out of place next to the gang's modern, aggressive machines. The man, unfazed by their noisy arrival, stood silently as he refueled his bike, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. Kenta's smirk widened. He lived for moments like this, intimidating others and asserting dominance. The man was perfect prey, quiet, unassuming, and alone. "Hey, old man," Kenta called out, walking toward him. The rest of the gang followed, their boots clomping heavily on the pavement. The man didn't respond, his movements deliberate as he secured the gas pump and replaced the cap on his tank. This only added fuel to Kenta's fire. "You deaf or just stupid?" Kenta taunted, stepping closer. "I'm talking to you." The man turned slowly, revealing a face weathered by years yet calm and composed. His dark eyes met Kenta's with an intensity that stopped the gang leader in his tracks, if only for a moment. "I heard you," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. One of the younger bikers, eager to impress, grabbed the man's shoulder. "You don't talk to Kenta like that." Before anyone could register what happened, the younger biker was on the ground, clutching his wrist in pain. The man hadn't moved much, just a swift, fluid motion, but it was enough to disarm the aggressor without causing serious harm. The gang stared, dumbfounded. "I don't want trouble," the man said, his voice steady, "but I won't tolerate disrespect." Continued. Final part of Chapter 1. Kenta's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a recognition that this man was no ordinary passerby. The tension was thick as the remaining bikers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a wiry man named Hiroshi, leaned closer to Kenta and whispered, "Boss, maybe we should just let this one go." "Let it go?" Kenta hissed, his pride stung. "He just humiliated one of our own. What do you think that makes us look like?" Hiroshi hesitated, but before he could respond, Rio, emboldened by Kenta's words, stepped forward. "He's just one guy. Let's teach him some manners." Kenta nodded, and the gang spread out, circling the man like predators closing in on their prey. The man remained calm, his posture relaxed but alert. His hands were empty, his expression unreadable. "Last chance," Kenta said, his voice dripping with menace. "You can apologize and maybe we'll let you go with just a scratch." The man tilted his head slightly, considering the offer. Then he spoke, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You should walk away. You don't know what you're dealing with." That was all the provocation Kenta needed. "Get him," he barked. The gang lunged as one, but what followed was nothing short of chaos. The man moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost inhuman. He sidestepped Rio's clumsy swing, redirecting the larger man's momentum into a hard tumble onto the pavement. Another biker swung a chain, but the man caught it midair, yanking it free and using it to disarm two others in one fluid motion. Gasps and curses filled the air as one by one, the iron wolves fell. The man's strikes were calculated, each movement designed to neutralize his attackers without inflicting unnecessary harm. It wasn't just skill, it was control, the kind that only came from years of discipline. Kenta stood frozen, watching his gang crumble. His hands clenched into fists, but his feet refused to move. When the man finally turned to him, Kenta felt a chill run down his spine. "Stay down," the man said, his voice carrying a weight that left no room for argument. Kenta swallowed hard, his bravado shattered. He nodded, and the man stepped back, his eyes scanning the group to ensure no one else was foolish enough to rise. Without another word, the man picked up his helmet, mounted his bike, and started the engine. As he pulled away, he glanced back at Kenta and his fallen crew. "Next time, think twice before crossing lines you don't understand." The rumble of his vintage motorcycle faded into the distance, leaving the iron wolves bruised and humiliated. For the first time in years, Kenta felt something foreign clawing at his chest. Respect. As the gang regrouped, Hiroshi spoke up, his voice tinged with awe. "Who the hell was that guy?" Kenta didn't answer. He simply stared down the empty road, his jaw clenched. Whoever the man was, one thing was certain. They had messed with the wrong person. The Iron Wolves regrouped at a nearby rest stop, their spirits bruised as much as their bodies. The gang sat in sullen silence, nursing their injuries under the dim glow of a vending machine. Kenta leaned against his bike, his jaw tight and his mind racing. He was no stranger to fights, but this one was different. The man hadn't just beaten them, he had dismantled them with an eerie calm that made Kenta's skin crawl. Rio broke the silence, slamming his fist on the table. "We can't let this slide, boss. That guy made us look like amateurs." "Made you look like an amateur?" Hiroshi muttered under his breath, earning a glare from Rio. "Shut it, both of you," Kenta snapped. He stared at the road ahead, the man's parting words echoing in his mind. "Next time, think twice before crossing lines you don't understand." What did that even mean? Who was he? "Boss, maybe we should leave it," Hiroshi ventured cautiously. "That guy, he wasn't normal. Did you see the way he moved? It's like he knew what we were going to do before we did it." "Are you scared, Hiroshi?" Rio sneered. "He's just one guy. We're the Iron Wolves." "And yet one guy took down the Iron Wolves," Hiroshi shot back. "What does that say about us?" The tension among the gang was palpable, but Kenta's focus was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the man's calm, piercing gaze. There was no anger, no malice, just an unshakable confidence that unnerved him. For the first time in years, Kenta felt outmatched, and he hated it. "He's not just some random guy," Kenta said finally, breaking the uneasy silence. "We need to find out who he is." The gang exchanged uncertain looks. It wasn't like Kenta to dwell on a loss. Usually he'd be plotting immediate retaliation. But this time, his tone carried something new, curiosity mixed with caution. The next day, Kenta began asking around at other biker hangouts, describing the man and his vintage bike. Most shrugged or shook their heads, but one old-timer in a dingy bar leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're talking about Keiji," the man said, his voice low. "Used to be a legend in these parts. People say he was a martial arts master, trained in techniques nobody's seen in decades. Some even say he was part of a secret clan, though that might just be stories. "Where is he now?" Kenta asked, his interest piqued. "Lives up in the mountains, far away from all this mess," the old-timer replied. "Keeps to himself, from what I hear. But listen, kid, if you're thinking of going after him, don't. Men like him, they don't fight for sport. They fight to end things." Kenta left the bar deep in thought. If this Keiji was as skilled as the rumors suggested, then their encounter at the gas station was no accident. He had to know more. Back at the gang's hideout, Kenta shared what he'd learned. The reaction was mixed. Some were eager for a rematch, while others looked uneasy. "Boss, maybe we should let this one go," Hiroshi said again. "If he's really that guy, do we want to risk it?" Kenta's eyes narrowed. "I don't care who he is. Nobody humiliates the Iron Wolves and gets away with it." That evening, the gang gathered outside, seated around a makeshift fire pit. The flames danced in the cool night air, casting flickering shadows on their faces. Hiroshi poked at the fire with a stick, breaking the silence. "You know, boss, maybe this Keiji isn't just some martial artist. What if he's part of something bigger?" Ryo scoffed. "Bigger? What, like some ancient warrior cult? Don't tell me you believe those old myths." Hiroshi shrugged. "All I'm saying is, it's weird. Who just disappears into the mountains and fights like that? There's got to be more to the story." Kenta remained silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. His mind replayed every moment of their encounter, the way Keiji moved, his calculated strikes, and, most of all, his unshaken composure. It was like fighting a force of nature. "We're not done with him," Kenta said finally, his voice firm. "But we're not going in blind, either. If we're going to face him, we need to know what we're dealing with." Far away, in the quiet of the mountains, Keiji sat cross-legged on the wooden porch of his cabin, staring out at the dark forest. The night was calm, but his thoughts were not. He could still feel the anger radiating from Kenta during their fight, a raw, unbridled rage born from years of unchecked pride. Keiji had seen men like Kenta before, men who sought power for the sake of control, who hid their insecurities behind bravado and violence. It was a dangerous path, one that rarely ended well. He sighed, looking down at his hands. They were calloused from years of training, hands that had once brought destruction and chaos. He had chosen this life of solitude to escape that cycle, to find peace. But now it seemed that peace was slipping away. As the wind rustled through the trees, Keiji closed his eyes and meditated, letting the sounds of the forest calm his restless mind. He knew the Iron Wolves wouldn't stop. Men like Kenta never did. But he also knew that his fight with them was far from over. The Iron Wolves were not known for their patience. By the third day after their humiliating defeat, the tension among the gang had reached a boiling point. Kenta had spent the past 2 days poring over what little information they had on Keiji, but it wasn't enough. He knew he needed a plan, a way to catch Keiji off guard. Waiting for him to make the first move wasn't an option. Kenta wasn't the kind of leader who let his enemies dictate the pace. "Boss," Ryo said, barging into the makeshift meeting room in their hideout, "I've got an idea." Kenta looked up, narrowing his eyes at the interruption. "Go on." Ryo grinned, a predatory glint in his eye. "We lure him out. That old man in the gas station? He's got to know something about Keiji. He looked scared out of his wits when we showed up. What if we make him talk?" Hiroshi, seated across the room, frowned. "You're talking about threatening some random guy. That's low, even for us." "And letting this guy walk all over us isn't," Ryo shot back, his tone heated. "We need leverage. Keiji obviously cares about something. Otherwise, he wouldn't have fought us. We find out what that is, and we use it." Kenta leaned back in his chair, weighing the options. He didn't like the idea of targeting an innocent, but Ryo had a point. Keiji wasn't some drifter passing through. He had a connection to this place. The gas station attendant might just be the key. "Fine," Kenta said after a long pause, "but no unnecessary violence. We lean on him just enough to get what we need. Understood." Rio smirked, nodding. "Crystal clear." The gang rolled up to the gas station at dusk, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. The old man behind the counter visibly stiffened when he saw the iron wolves approaching, their boots thudding ominously against the ground. "Evening," Kenta said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "We're looking for some information. Thought you might be able to help." "I don't know anything," the old man stammered, his hands trembling as he fumbled with a stack of receipts. "See, I don't think that's true," Rio interjected, leaning over the counter. "You've been here a long time, haven't you? You've seen a lot of people come and go. We're just asking for a little help." The old man swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the security camera in the corner. I don't know what you're talking about. Please, leave me alone." Hiroshi, standing near the entrance, shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, this feels wrong. Let's just go." Kenta ignored him, stepping closer to the counter. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his tone low and steady. "We just need to know about the guy on the old bike. Keiji, you know him, don't you?" The old man froze, his face pale. His silence was all the confirmation they needed. "Tell us what you know," Kenta pressed, his patience wearing thin. "Where can we find him?" Before the old man could respond, the sound of an engine roared to life outside. The gang turned in unison, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons. A single headlight cut through the twilight, illuminating a figure on a vintage motorcycle. Keiji. The tension was palpable as Keiji dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. The old man behind the counter exhaled sharply, relief washing over his face. "I thought I warned you," Keiji said finally, his voice calm but firm. "You should have stayed down." Rio sneered, stepping forward. "And let you get away with humiliating us? Not a chance." Keiji's eyes flicked to Kenta, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "You're their leader. You should know better than to drag others into your mess." Kenta bristled, his pride stung. "And you should know better than to pick a fight you can't finish." The gang spread out, circling Keiji like a pack of wolves. But Keiji didn't flinch. His stance was relaxed, almost casual, as if he were utterly unconcerned by the danger surrounding him. "You think numbers will help you?" Keiji asked, a faint hint of amusement in his tone. "All it does is give me more opportunities." Rio lunged first, swinging a crowbar in a wide arc. Keiji sidestepped effortlessly, his hand snapping out to grab Rio's wrist. With a sharp twist, Rio cried out, dropping the weapon as he stumbled backward. The fight erupted in a flurry of motion. Keiji moved like a shadow, slipping between his attackers with uncanny precision. Each strike was calculated, each movement deliberate. It wasn't just skill, it was mastery. Within minutes, the gang lay scattered across the ground, groaning in pain. Kenta stood frozen, his fists clenched. Keiji approached him slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is your last warning," Keiji said, his voice quiet but firm. "Walk away. The next time we meet, I won't be so lenient." Kenta's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Keiji mounted his bike, the roar of the engine breaking the silence as he rode off into the night. As the dust settled, Hiroshi helped Rio to his feet, his expression grim. "Boss, maybe it's time we let this go." But Kenta didn't respond. He stared down the road where Keiji had disappeared, his mind racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Kenta sat alone in the dimly lit hideout, the faint hum of a distant highway the only sound breaking the silence. The air was thick with tension, and the gang had scattered for the night, too beaten and humiliated to face each other. For the first time in years, Kenta found himself grappling with doubt. His pride wouldn't let him admit it, but the truth gnawed at him. Keiji wasn't just another opponent. There was something different about him, something Kenta couldn't put into words. It wasn't just his skill, it was his presence. Keiji had walked into that fight with no fear, no hesitation, and no doubt. That confidence had shaken Kenta more than he cared to admit. "Boss?" Hiroshi's voice broke through the silence, hesitant and quiet. He lingered at the edge of the room, his posture uncertain. "Got a minute?" Kenta grunted, not looking up. "What is it?" Hiroshi stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. "I've been thinking. Maybe this isn't about pride anymore. Maybe we need to step back and ask ourselves what we're really fighting for." Kenta's eyes snapped to Hiroshi, his glare sharp enough to cut through steel. "What are you saying? That we let this guy humiliate us and walk away?" "I'm saying maybe this isn't about us," Hiroshi replied, his tone measured. "Keiji doesn't seem like the kind of guy who's looking for trouble. We're the ones who keep chasing him. Maybe it's time to let it go." Kenta slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Let it go. He made fools of us, of me. Do you have any idea what that means for our reputation?" Hiroshi held his ground, his expression calm but firm. "And what does it mean if we keep losing? What happens if he beats us again and again? At some point, boss, we have to ask if it's worth it." The room fell silent, Kenta's glare burning into Hiroshi. But behind the anger was something deeper. Doubt. For a fleeting moment, Kenta considered Hiroshi's words, the weight of them pressing against his chest. But his pride was too strong, too ingrained to let him back down. "Get out," Kenta said, his voice low and dangerous. Hiroshi hesitated, then turned and left without another word. That night, Kenta's dreams were filled with fragments of his past. Memories of his early days as a gang leader, when he was hungry and desperate, willing to do whatever it took to carve out a name for himself. He had built the Iron Wolves from nothing, pulling in misfits and outcasts, giving them a purpose and a place to belong. But over the years, that purpose had twisted into something darker. In his dream, he saw himself as a young man, standing over a defeated rival. The crowd had cheered his name, their voices ringing in his ears like a symphony. It was the first taste of power, and he had craved it ever since. But now, as he stood in the middle of a darkened field, he felt a presence watching him. Keiji. The man appeared out of the shadows, his calm gaze piercing through Kenta's defenses. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough. Kenta lunged at him, but Keiji vanished, leaving Kenta grasping at empty air. The dream shifted, the cheers of the crowd fading into silence. Kenta stood alone, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy chain. He woke with a start, his chest heaving and his fists clenched. The room was dark, the faint glow of the streetlight seeping through the cracks in the curtains. For a moment, he sat in silence, his mind racing. The dream had shaken him, but he pushed the feelings aside. Dreams were meaningless, he told himself. They didn't change the fact that Keiji had to be dealt with. The next morning, Kenta gathered the gang in the main room. Ryo and Hiroshi sat on opposite sides of the table, the tension between them palpable. The rest of the gang listened quietly, their faces a mix of exhaustion and uncertainty. "We're not done," Kenta said, his voice steady but cold. "Keiji thinks he's untouchable, but nobody's invincible. We've been going about this the wrong way. If we want to beat him, we need to be smarter." Hiroshi frowned but said nothing. Ryo, on the other hand, smirked. "Finally, what's the plan, boss?" Kenta leaned forward, his gaze hard. "We're going to find out everything there is to know about him. Where he goes, who he talks to, what he values. Everyone has a weakness, and Keiji is no exception." The gang murmured in agreement, the energy in the room shifting as Kenta's resolve reignited their confidence. But Hiroshi remained silent, his expression unreadable. As the meeting ended and the gang began to disperse, Hiroshi approached Kenta. "Boss," he said quietly, "are you sure this is the right call?" Kenta didn't look at him. "If you're not with me, Hiroshi, You're against me." Hiroshi sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I just hope you know what you're doing." Far away, in the quiet of the mountains, Keiji sat on the edge of a rocky outcrop, gazing out at the horizon. The morning sun bathed the landscape in a golden light, the world below shrouded in mist. He had felt the shift in the air, the storm brewing on the horizon. Kenta's pride wouldn't let him walk away, and Keiji knew it. As he closed his eyes, the wind carried the faint sound of distant engines, a warning of what was to come. In a quiet village nestled at the base of the mountains, the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on narrow dirt paths. Children laughed and played near the central well, and vendors arranged their wares, their chatter filling the crisp air. It was a place untouched by the chaos of the outside world, a sanctuary of simplicity. Haru, a boy of 12 with unruly black hair and a mischievous grin, darted through the village with boundless energy. He carried a basket of vegetables for his mother, but his mind was elsewhere. For weeks, rumors had spread about the strange man who lived in the mountains. Whispers of his strength and skill had reached even the quietest corners of the village. "Keiji," Haru whispered to himself, his eyes wide with wonder. The name was spoken with awe and trepidation. Some said he was a warrior from a forgotten time. Others claimed he was a ghost, haunting the peaks. Haru's curiosity burned brighter with every passing day. "Haru!" His mother's voice cut through his thoughts. He skidded to a halt near the house, the basket wobbling in his arms. "Yes, Mama," he called, running to the doorway. "Finish your chores before you get into trouble," she said, shaking her head with a knowing smile. "I can see that look in your eye. Whatever you're planning, forget it." Haru grinned sheepishly. "Of course, Mama." But as he helped sort the vegetables and clean the yard, his mind was already plotting his next move. He had to know more about Keiji. What kind of man could inspire such stories? That afternoon, Haru slipped away from the village, his heart pounding with excitement. He climbed the winding paths leading into the mountains, the forest growing denser with every step. Birds chirped overhead, and the scent of pine filled the air. Haru's mind raced with questions. If the stories were true, what kind of person would Keiji be? Would he be dangerous? Kind? Mysterious? As he ventured deeper into the woods, Haru stumbled upon a clearing. There, in the center, stood a small cabin with a slanted roof and weathered wooden walls. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint sound of a stream trickled nearby. Haru crouched behind a tree, his heart hammering in his chest. A figure emerged from the cabin, moving with a deliberate grace that made Haru freeze. Keiji. The man was taller than Haru expected, his broad shoulders and strong frame a testament to years of discipline. His face was calm, his dark eyes scanning the clearing as if sensing something was amiss. Haru held his breath, his body trembling with both fear and excitement. Keiji moved toward a training dummy near the edge of the clearing. The boy watched in awe as the man began a series of movements, strikes, blocks, and counters, each one fluid and precise. The air seemed to hum with energy as Keiji practiced, his focus unshakable. Haru was so entranced that he didn't notice the twig beneath his foot until it snapped. The sound echoed like a thunderclap in the quiet forest. Keiji's head snapped toward the source, his eyes locking onto Haru's hiding spot. "Come out," Keiji said, his voice calm but commanding. Haru hesitated, his legs rooted to the ground. But there was no escaping now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out from behind the tree, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," Haru blurted, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to spy on you. I was just curious." Keiji studied the boy for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he lowered his hands, the tension in his posture easing. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said, "especially here." Haru swallowed hard, his eyes wide. "Are you Keiji? The one everyone talks about?" Keiji's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile. "And what do they say?" "They say you're a warrior," Haru said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "That you're stronger than anyone and that you live here to train and—" He stopped, realizing he was rambling. "And what do you think?" Keiji asked, his tone light but probing. Haru hesitated, then said, "I think you're amazing. The way you move, it's like you're not even human." Keiji chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm as human as you are, boy, but strength comes from discipline, not myths." Haru blinked, absorbing the words. "Can you teach me?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop himself. Keiji raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening. "Why do you want to learn?" Haru hesitated, searching for the right words. "I want to protect my family," he said finally, "and the village. If I were strong, no one would have to be afraid." Keiji studied the boy, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he said, "Go home, Haru. Come back when you're older, if you still feel the same." Haru's shoulders slumped, disappointment washing over him. "But, go home," Keiji repeated, his tone firm but not unkind. Haru nodded reluctantly, turning back toward the path. As he walked away, he glanced over his shoulder, watching as Keiji returned to his training. Despite the rejection, Haru's curiosity burned brighter than ever. Back in the village, Haru sat by the well, replaying the encounter in his mind. He had seen something extraordinary, something that most people could only dream of. And though Keiji had turned him away, Haru felt a spark of determination igniting within him. He would prove himself, one way or another. Far above, Keiji stood on the edge of the clearing, watching as the boy disappeared into the trees. A faint smile touched his lips. The boy reminded him of someone. A younger version of himself, perhaps. But the world was harsh, and Keiji knew the path Haru sought would not be easy. "Curiosity," Keiji murmured, turning back toward his cabin. "A dangerous thing." The Iron Wolves had regrouped, their pride battered but far from broken. Kenta, their leader, was more determined than ever to reclaim the gang's reputation and his own sense of control. The sting of defeat at Keiji's hands had festered into something deeper, an obsession. For days, Kenta had been devising a plan. He knew that brute force wasn't enough. Keiji's skill and precision were unlike anything he'd encountered. But even the strongest opponent had a weakness, and Kenta was determined to find it. He spent hours replaying every detail of their encounters, searching for a chink in Keiji's armor. He needed an edge. "Ryo, Hiroshi," Kenta called, his voice cutting through the chatter in their hideout. The gang members quieted immediately, their attention snapping to their leader. The two men approached, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Ryo was eager, his temper flaring with every mention of Keiji's name. Hiroshi, on the other hand, had grown more reserved since their last encounter with the mysterious warrior. "We're going to set a trap," Kenta said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Keiji may be strong, but he's not invincible. We'll lure him into a situation where his skills won't matter." Hiroshi frowned. "And how do we do that, boss? He's not exactly predictable." Kenta smirked, his confidence unwavering. "That's why we create the conditions. If we control the setting, we control the fight." The gang spent the next 2 days laying the groundwork. Kenta had chosen an abandoned quarry on the outskirts of the mountains, a place with limited escape routes and plenty of opportunities for ambush. The terrain was uneven, with jagged rocks and deep pits that could be used to their advantage. They set traps, rigged nets, and scattered debris to create obstacles that would slow Keiji down. Hiroshi watched uneasily as the gang worked, his gut churning with doubt. He had always trusted Kenta's leadership, but this felt different. There was a desperation in Kenta's eyes, a need to prove himself that bordered on recklessness. "Boss," Hiroshi said quietly, pulling Kenta aside as the others prepared the final touches. Are you sure about this? Keiji's not like anyone we fought before. What if it doesn't go as planned? Kenta's expression hardened. It will work. It has to. We can't keep running from this guy, Hiroshi. If we don't stop him now, we'll never get our respect back. Hiroshi sighed but said nothing more. Deep down, he hoped Kenta was right. The trap was set, and the gang lay in wait. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the quarry. Kenta had sent one of the newer recruits to bait Keiji, knowing that the man wouldn't ignore a cry for help. The boy was to pretend he was injured, luring Keiji to the location under false pretenses. Hours passed, the tension thick in the air. The gang members crouched in hiding, their weapons at the ready. Ryo's knuckles were white as he gripped his crowbar, his eyes darting nervously between the shadows. Finally, the sound of an engine echoed through the quarry, low and steady. The gang tensed, their hearts pounding. Keiji's motorcycle appeared at the edge of the clearing, the man dismounting with the same calm confidence that had infuriated Kenta during their last encounter. Keiji's eyes scanned the area, his expression unreadable. He moved toward the boy lying on the ground, his steps deliberate but cautious. As he knelt to check the boy's condition, Kenta gave the signal. The ambush erupted in a cacophony of noise. Gang members surged from their hiding places, their weapons raised. Keiji didn't flinch. His hand shot out, grabbing a nearby piece of debris and using it as a makeshift shield against the first wave of attacks. The traps activated in quick succession. A net shot up from the ground, but Keiji sidestepped it with uncanny precision. Rocks tumbled from above, but he was already moving, his body a blur of calculated motion. Kenta watched from his vantage point, his frustration growing with every failed attempt. "He's too fast," Ryo shouted, his voice tinged with panic as Keiji disarmed another attacker. Kenta's jaw clenched. "Stick to the plan. Corner him." The gang regrouped, closing in on Keiji from all sides. But the man didn't slow. He used the terrain to his advantage, maneuvering through the narrow spaces with an agility that defied logic. His strikes were precise, each one neutralizing an opponent with minimal effort. It was like watching a storm. Chaotic, yet controlled. As the dust settled, the gang lay scattered, groaning in pain. Keiji stood in the center of the quarry, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on Kenta. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the unspoken challenge hanging between them. Kenta stepped forward, his hands curling into fists. "You think you've won?" he spat. "This isn't over." Keiji tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "It was over the moment you let pride dictate your actions." The words hit Kenta like a blow, but he refused to show it. "You don't know anything about me." Keiji's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "I know enough. Walk away, Kenta. This path leads nowhere." With that, Keiji turned and walked back to his motorcycle, the roar of the engine fading into the distance as he disappeared into the night. Kenta stood in the silence, his fists trembling at his sides. Hiroshi approached cautiously, his face pale. "Boss, maybe it's time to let this go." But Kenta didn't answer. He stared at the ground, the weight of his defeat pressing down on him. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was personal. Keiji stood at the edge of the mountain stream, his reflection rippling in the clear water. The early morning sun filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns across the rocky terrain. He dipped his hands into the cold water, letting the chill ground him. The events of the past weeks had stirred memories he had long tried to bury. The iron wolves, their leader Kenta, and the relentless pride that drove them, it was all too familiar. They reminded him of another time, another life, when he had been just as reckless, just as consumed by the need to prove himself. Back then, the stakes had been different, but the cost had been the same. Keiji closed his eyes, allowing the sounds of the forest to lull him into a meditative state. His mind drifted back to the beginning, to the days when he had been a young and eager warrior in a world that demanded strength above all else. As a boy, Keiji had grown up in a small village much like the one nestled at the base of the mountains now. His father had been a farmer, a man of quiet strength who believed in hard work and humility. But Keiji had always been restless, his spirit too wild for the life of a farmer. One day, a group of travelers passed through the village, their leader a master of a martial art Keiji had never seen before. The way they moved, the discipline in their every action, it was like poetry in motion. Keiji begged his father to let him train with them. At first, his father refused, fearing that Keiji's hunger for power would lead him down a dangerous road. But Keiji's determination was unshakable. With a heavy heart, his father finally relented, warning him to never let pride overshadow purpose. The years that followed were grueling. Keiji trained under the master's watchful eye, enduring hardships that would have broken lesser men. He learned not just combat, but the philosophy behind it, the importance of balance, discipline, and restraint. But even as he excelled, Keiji struggled to accept those lessons. "I don't need balance," he had once told his master in frustration. "I need strength." The master regarded him with quiet sadness. "Strength without balance is chaos, Keiji. Power without purpose destroys more than it protects." At the time, Keiji dismissed the words as musings of an old man. It wasn't until much later, after the choices he made led to ruin, that he understood. Keiji's thoughts were interrupted by rustling leaves. He opened his eyes, his senses alert. A figure emerged from the trees, Haru, the boy from the village. He stood hesitantly at the clearing's edge, clutching a small satchel. "What are you doing here?" Keiji asked, calm but firm. Haru hesitated, then stepped forward. "I brought you something," he said, holding out the satchel. "Food. Mama said you probably don't have much up here." Keiji frowned but accepted it. "Your mother knows you're here?" Haru shook his head, sheepish. "She'd kill me if she found out, but I wanted to see you again." Keiji sighed, setting the satchel aside. "You shouldn't be here, Haru. The path you're curious about, it's not easy." "I don't care," Haru said, firm. "I want to learn. I want to be strong. Like you." Keiji studied the boy, seeing a reflection of his younger self, the same determination, the same hunger for something more. But he also saw the danger, the path leading to his own mistakes. "Being strong isn't just about fighting," Keiji said. "It's about knowing when not to fight, about protecting what matters, not feeding pride." Haru frowned. "How do you know when to fight? What's worth protecting?" Keiji turned back to the stream, water rushing over rocks in an endless cycle. "You'll know," he said quietly, "when the time comes." Haru didn't look convinced but nodded. "Can I stay? Just for a while?" Keiji hesitated, then gestured toward a flat rock near the stream. "Sit, no questions." Haru grinned, plopping down to watch Keiji's morning exercises. The boy's presence was a distraction, but Keiji found he didn't mind as much as he thought. Keiji's mind drifted back to the moment that changed everything. A decision made in anger, a fight that spiraled out of control. The scars lingered, not just on his body but on his soul. He had won that fight, but the cost was too high. Innocent lives were caught in the crossfire. Guilt drove him into the mountains, away from the life he knew. He swore never to let pride dictate his actions again. Watching Haru, Keiji felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the boy could avoid the path that had led Keiji to solitude. But hope was fragile, and the world a harsh teacher. "Haru," Keiji said, breaking the silence. "Go home. Your mother will worry." Haru stood reluctantly. "Will you teach me one day?" Keiji didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said, "if you're ready." Haru's face lit up. He ran back toward the village, the satchel empty in Keiji's hands. Keiji turned back to the stream, his reflection staring back. Strength without balance is chaos, he murmured, his master's words echoing. The sound of distant engines reached his ears, faint but unmistakable. The Iron Wolves weren't done with him. Not yet. The Iron Wolves' hideout was silent, save for the occasional scrape of a chair or the low murmurs of the remaining gang members. The failed ambush weighed heavily on them, but none felt its burden more than Kenta. He sat in the dimly lit back room, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. Keiji had humiliated them again. Rio, still nursing a bruised rib, shuffled into the room and hesitated before speaking. "Boss? What now?" Kenta exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He had spent years building the Iron Wolves, turning them from a ragtag group of outcasts into something formidable. And yet, in just a few encounters, Keiji had torn down everything he had worked for. "He's playing with us," Kenta muttered. "He's making us look weak." Hiroshi leaned forward, his tone careful. "Maybe it's time to rethink this, boss. Every time we go after him, we lose." Kenta's eyes flashed dangerously. "Are you saying we give up?" "I'm saying we need to be smart," Hiroshi said. "Keiji isn't just some thug we can intimidate. He's something else, and if we keep throwing ourselves at him without a plan, we're going to keep getting crushed." Kenta slammed his fist onto the table. "I won't let some nobody walk all over me." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Rio cleared his throat. "So, what's the plan?" Kenta leaned back, his mind racing. If brute force wasn't enough, he needed to attack from another angle, something Keiji wouldn't see coming. A slow grin spread across his lips. "We stop fighting on his terms," Kenta said. "We hit him where it hurts." Hiroshi frowned. "What do you mean?" Kenta's grin widened. "The village." The room went still. Rio blinked. "You want to—" "I want to send a message," Kenta interrupted. "Keiji's been protecting them, hasn't he? That means he cares. If we shake things up a little, he'll come to us." Hiroshi looked uneasy. "Those people have nothing to do with this." Kenta's gaze darkened. "They have everything to do with this. They're his weakness." The Iron Wolves arrived at the village under the cover of night, their motorcycles rolling to a stop just beyond the main road. The town was quiet, most of the residents asleep. A single street lamp flickered near the square, casting long shadows against the cobblestone paths. Kenta dismounted first. "Keep it subtle," he said. "We're here to make a point, not to destroy everything." Rio and two others split off to slash tires and break windows. Hiroshi, however, remained still, watching from the edge of the group. Something about this felt wrong. As Rio smashed a bottle against the side of a shop, the noise rang out through the night. A light flicked on in one of the nearby homes, and the silhouette of an old man appeared in the doorway. "Who's there?" the man called. Kenta stepped forward. "Just passing through," he said smoothly. The old man squinted. "This is a peaceful town. You should move along." Kenta smirked. "That so? I think we'll stay a little longer." More lights flickered on. Villagers peeked through windows, confusion turning to fear as they recognized the gang. Hiroshi clenched his fists. "Boss, this is enough. They get the message." But Kenta wasn't listening. He grabbed a wooden crate and threw it into the street, its contents spilling across the dirt road. "Where's your hero now?" he called. "Let's see if he comes running." A door creaked open. Haru. The boy stood on the porch of his home, his small frame tense but defiant. His mother stood behind him, holding his shoulder. Kenta's gaze locked onto the boy, and a slow realization dawned. Keiji had taken an interest in this kid. A cruel grin spread across Kenta's face. "Well, well," he said, stepping toward Haru. "You look familiar." Haru didn't move. Hiroshi stepped between them. "That's enough, Kenta." Kenta raised an eyebrow. "You questioning me, Hiroshi?" The older gang member didn't flinch. "There's a line. This is it." Kenta scoffed, but before he could respond, a sharp sound cut through the air. A single rock thrown from the darkness struck the ground inches from Kenta's boot. The gang turned as one. There, standing at the far end of the square, was Keiji. His silhouette was barely visible under the dim light, but his presence was unmistakable. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes held something dangerous. "I suggest you leave," Keiji said, his voice quiet but firm. Kenta's hands clenched into fists. "Finally," he muttered. "I was starting to think you wouldn't show." Keiji didn't move. "You're threatening innocent people. That's beneath even you." Kenta sneered. "Nothing's beneath me when it comes to winning." Keiji exhaled slowly. "Then you've already lost." The tension thickened. The villagers remained frozen while the gang shifted uneasily. Hiroshi, watching from the side, looked at Keiji, then at Kenta. This was spiraling out of control. Kenta grinned. "You're not so tough when you've got something to protect, are you?" Keiji's gaze remained steady. "I protect because I choose to. You fight because you're afraid of losing control." Kenta's smile faltered. Then he lunged. Keiji sidestepped effortlessly, twisting Kenta's momentum against him and sending him crashing into a cart. Before Ryo or the others could react, Keiji was already moving, striking with precise, measured force. Within seconds, 3 of them were on the ground. Hiroshi didn't move to help. He only watched. Kenta struggled to his feet, breathing heavily. His eyes burned with fury, but there was something else in them now. Doubt. "You don't belong in this world anymore," Kenta spat. "Men like you don't last." Keiji regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "Men like me don't need to." With that, he turned and walked away. Kenta stood motionless, his fists trembling. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do. The village remained silent long after the Iron Wolves had retreated. The tension that had gripped the air dissipated, replaced by an eerie stillness. The only sounds were the distant hum of the gang's motorcycles fading into the night and the hushed whispers of the villagers, still shaken by what had transpired. Keiji stood in the square, his stance relaxed but his mind sharp. He had expected Kenta to escalate, but targeting the village had crossed a line. He exhaled slowly, scanning the frightened faces around him. The people here had nothing to do with the war Kenta was waging, yet they had been dragged into it. Haru, still standing on his porch, watched Keiji intently. His mother pulled him back inside, but not before he caught Keiji's gaze, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Keiji turned away, stepping toward the center of the square where broken crates and shattered glass lay scattered. A few villagers emerged, hesitant, unsure if the danger had truly passed. One of the elders, a man named Daichi, stepped forward, his face lined with concern. "Is it over?" Keiji shook his head. "Not yet." Daichi's expression darkened. "Then what do we do?" Keiji glanced at the frightened families peering from doorways. He had spent years avoiding attachments, but now he had a choice to make, and he had already made it. "You need to be ready," Keiji said. "Kenta won't stop. He's not just trying to hurt me. He wants control. This won't be the last time he comes here." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Some of the younger men clenched their fists while others exchanged nervous glances. They had lived in peace for so long. The idea of war reaching them was unimaginable. "What do you suggest?" Daichi asked. Keiji's gaze swept across the villagers. "You learn to defend yourselves." There was a pause. Then a voice spoke up. "Like you." It was Haru. He had stepped back onto the porch, his small frame silhouetted by the warm light from inside his home. His eyes burned with determination. Keiji studied him before answering. "Yes." The following morning, the village gathered in the square. The tension from the previous night had not disappeared, but something new had settled in its place, a quiet resolve. Keiji stood at the center, arms crossed. Fighting is not about revenge or pride. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. The villagers listened. Among them were men who had worked the fields all their lives, shopkeepers with no experience in combat, and young boys barely old enough to understand war. "I will teach you how to defend yourselves," Keiji continued, "not to seek out battle, but to stand when the time comes." Daichi nodded. "We will do what we must." Keiji glanced at Haru, who stood at the front. The boy's eagerness was unmistakable. He was young, but his spirit was unyielding. "You'll start with discipline," Keiji said. "Strength is meaningless without control." Haru straightened. "I'm ready." Keiji said nothing, but he saw himself in the boy's stance. The same hunger, the same fire. Training began at dawn. Keiji led them to an open field beyond the village where the ground was firm. He started with the basics: stances, movement, breath control. Many of the villagers struggled, unused to the demands of combat, but they pushed through, determination outweighing discomfort. Haru, despite his small size, was the most persistent. He mimicked Keiji's movements with unwavering focus. Keiji corrected him when needed, but offered no praise. Strength was built through effort, not words. Days passed. The villagers improved, their movements sharper, their stances more stable. Confidence began to replace fear. But Keiji knew it would not be enough. Kenta would return, and when he did, it would not be with idle threats. One evening, as the last of the villagers dispersed, Haru lingered behind. "Keiji," he said. Keiji looked at him. "I know why you're doing this," Haru continued, "but will it be enough?" Keiji studied him carefully. "It has to be." Haru nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "And if it isn't?" Keiji's gaze drifted to the horizon. "Then we fight." Keiji remained in the field long after Haru had left, his mind clouded with the weight of what lay ahead. He had seen war before. He knew the way men changed when they fought for something, or someone, they cared about. The villagers were not soldiers. They were simple people who had lived their lives in peace. But peace, Keiji had learned long ago, was fragile. A sound behind him made him turn. Hiroshi stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed. Keiji tensed, ready for a fight, but Hiroshi raised a hand. "I'm not here to fight." Keiji's gaze remained steady. "Then why are you here?" Hiroshi hesitated. "I wanted to see what kind of man you really are." Keiji didn't answer. Hiroshi stepped forward. "You know Kenta isn't going to stop. He's losing control, and that makes him dangerous." Keiji nodded. "I know." Hiroshi sighed. "I don't agree with what he's doing. I never did. But loyalty, it's not something you throw away easily." Keiji studied him. "And yet, you're here." Hiroshi exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I'm here." There was silence between them, the wind rustling the grass at their feet. Finally, Hiroshi spoke again. "When the time comes, I won't stand in your way, but I can't stand against him either. Not yet." Keiji understood. He had been where Hiroshi was now, torn between the past and the future, between loyalty and morality. It was a hard place to be. "When you're ready," Keiji said, "you'll know what to do." Hiroshi nodded. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Keiji watched him go, the weight in his chest growing heavier. The battle was coming, and this time there would be no turning back. The night was thick with humidity, the air hanging heavy over the Iron Wolves' hideout. A single lantern flickered at the entrance, casting jagged shadows against the rusted metal walls of the abandoned warehouse they had claimed as their base. Inside, tension simmered. Kenta stood at the center of the room, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Around him, his men lingered in uneasy silence, waiting for their leader to speak. The events of the past days had left them restless, humiliated. Keiji had outmaneuvered them at every turn, and now the village was preparing for war. Kenta's patience had worn thin. Rio, still nursing the bruises from their last encounter, leaned forward. "Boss, we can't just let this slide. That bastard is making us look weak." Kenta exhaled sharply. "I know." His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "That's why we're going to end this." Hiroshi, standing near the back, remained quiet. He had seen the shift in Kenta's demeanor. There was desperation in his eyes now, a dangerous recklessness. Hiroshi had spent years following Kenta, believing in the power he had built within the gang. But this was spiraling into something else. "What's the plan?" Rio asked. Kenta's gaze darkened. "We hit them harder. We don't just scare them this time. We take control." A murmur spread through the room. The gang had always prided itself on dominance, but attacking a village outright was another level. Some exchanged uncertain glances, but no one dared to speak against Kenta. Hiroshi, however, stepped forward. "Boss, think about this." Kenta shot him a glare. "I have thought about this." Hiroshi didn't back down. "No, you haven't. You're letting your pride make decisions. We go in there full force. We're making enemies out of more than just Keiji. The whole village will resist. And Keiji, he won't let it slide. He's not afraid of us." Kenta's fingers curled into fists. "I'm not afraid of him either." "That's the problem," Hiroshi muttered. Kenta's glare hardened. "You're either with us or you're not." A long pause. The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. Hiroshi looked around at the gang, at the men who had once been nothing more than outcasts, at the men who had followed Kenta's vision. There was a time when he believed in it too. But now he wasn't sure. He took a step back. Kenta sneered. "Coward." Hiroshi met his gaze. "You'll regret this." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Kenta let him go. He had bigger concerns. "Get your bikes ready," he ordered. "We ride at dawn." The village was quiet when the roar of motorcycles shattered the early morning stillness. Keiji had sensed it coming. He had felt the storm brewing in the air, had seen it in Kenta's eyes. He stood at the center of the square, waiting, his posture relaxed but his muscles coiled. The villagers, though frightened, stood behind him. They were no longer defenseless. The iron wolves rolled into the square, their bikes kicking up dust as they came to a stop. Kenta dismounted first, his expression unreadable, but the anger simmering beneath was unmistakable. "You should have left when you had the chance," Kenta said, stepping forward. Keiji didn't move. "I don't run." Kenta smirked. "Then you're a fool." The gang members shifted, ready for a fight. But Keiji remained still. "This isn't just about you anymore," Keiji said. "You're dragging innocent people into your war." Kenta scoffed. "There's no such thing as innocence." Keiji's eyes narrowed. "That's where we're different." The moment stretched, taut as a drawn blade. Then Kenta lunged. Keiji sidestepped, catching Kenta's arm and twisting, sending him stumbling. The first punch landed before Kenta could recover, a precise, devastating strike to his ribs. Kenta gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and swung wildly. Keiji ducked. The fight exploded. The gang surged forward, but the villagers did not scatter. They had trained for this. They fought back, not with rage, but with control. Keiji had taught them well. Haru, despite Keiji's earlier warnings, threw himself into the chaos. He wasn't strong, but he was fast. He ducked, weaving through the fight, using everything Keiji had shown him. Kenta's fury grew. He swung again, but Keiji caught his wrist and drove his elbow into Kenta's gut, sending him crashing to the ground. For the first time, the iron wolves hesitated. Keiji didn't let up. He grabbed Kenta by the collar, forcing him to meet his gaze. "This is over," Keiji said, his voice low but commanding. Kenta's breathing was ragged. His pride had led him here, and now he was staring at the consequences. The gang stood frozen, waiting for their leader's command. But Kenta had none to give. Keiji let go, stepping back. "Leave, and don't come back." For a long moment, Kenta lay there, his fists clenched, his pride screaming at him to fight. But his body ached, and his men were already backing away. The iron wolves had lost. Without another word, Kenta pushed himself up, turned, and walked toward his bike. One by one, the gang followed. The roar of their engines faded into the distance. The village was silent. Then, slowly, relief spread through the crowd. They had won. Keiji turned, meeting Haru's wide-eyed gaze. "You disobeyed me," Keiji said. Haru swallowed. "I had to." Keiji studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "Next time, don't be reckless." Haru grinned. "Yes, Sensei." Keiji sighed. "I never agreed to that." The villagers laughed, the tension breaking at last. The war wasn't over, but today they had won. The road stretched endlessly before Hiroshi, the sound of his lone motorcycle cutting through the early morning silence. The iron wolves were gone, but their shadow still loomed over him. He had turned his back on them, but was it enough? Would simply walking away cleanse him of the choices he had made? He tightened his grip on the handlebars, his thoughts as turbulent as the wind rushing past him. Hiroshi had always been loyal to Kenta. They had built the gang together, carving a place for themselves in a world that had no room for men like them. But Kenta had changed. His ambition had turned to desperation, his hunger for control into something reckless. Hiroshi had seen it coming, but he had stayed. He had told himself it was just another fight, another challenge. But last night, standing in that village watching innocent people take up arms against them, it had shaken something loose in him. He pulled off the road, stopping at the edge of a riverbank. The water was calm, untouched by the chaos he had left behind. He dismounted, letting the silence press in around him. His reflection wavered in the water, and for the first time in years, he questioned what he saw. Was he still one of them? Could he ever be anything else? A sound behind him made him turn. Keiji. The man stood a few feet away, his presence as steady as ever. Hiroshi wasn't surprised. Keiji had always been good at tracking people, at sensing where he was needed. "You followed me," Hiroshi said. Keiji shrugged. "Didn't have to. You're predictable." Hiroshi huffed a short laugh. "That's a first?" Keiji stepped closer but kept his distance. "You left." "I did." "Why?" Hiroshi sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I got tired of lying to myself." He looked at Keiji. "You were right. Kenta isn't just fighting you. He's fighting himself, and he's dragging everyone down with him." Keiji nodded but said nothing. Hiroshi hesitated. "I don't know what comes next." Keiji studied him. "That depends." "On what?" "On what you're willing to do." Hiroshi exhaled slowly. He had spent years fighting, surviving. It was all he knew. Could he really walk away from that? He looked back at the river. "I don't want to be your enemy." Keiji's voice was calm. "Then don't be." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Hiroshi turned them over in his mind. Keiji didn't push. He only watched, waiting. Finally, Hiroshi spoke. "I need time." Keiji nodded. "Time won't stop Kenta." Hiroshi clenched his jaw. "I know." Silence settled between them. There was no easy answer, no clear path forward. But for the first time, Hiroshi wasn't looking back. Keiji turned. "When you decide," he said, "you know where to find me. Then he was gone. Hiroshi remained by the river, the weight of his choices pressing against him. He had left the Iron Wolves. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Hiroshi sat by the river for hours. The sun climbed higher, its reflection dancing on the surface of the water, but he remained still. Memories surfaced. Years spent by Kenta's side, battles fought together, victories and losses alike. They had started as brothers, but something had shifted. The Kenta he once knew had been different, a leader who commanded respect, not fear. Somewhere along the way, power had warped him. Had he himself changed too? A rustling in the trees made Hiroshi tense. He turned sharply, hand instinctively reaching for his belt, but it was only an old fisherman making his way toward the river bank. The man glanced at him but said nothing, tossing his line into the water with practiced ease. "Lost?" the old man finally asked without looking at him. Hiroshi smirked. "Something like that." The old man nodded sagely. "Men who stare at rivers too long are usually running from something." Hiroshi exhaled through his nose. Not running, just deciding. The old man reeled his line in, checking the bait before casting again. Decisions are like fishing. You can wait forever, but at some point you gotta pull something in. Hiroshi chuckled dryly. "That simple, huh?" The old man shrugged. "Nothing ever is." They sat in silence, the only sound the water lapping against the shore. For the first time in a long while, Hiroshi felt the weight of his own thoughts. Was there a way forward that didn't involve bloodshed? Could he face Kenta again? And if it came to it, could he fight him? By the time Hiroshi got back on his bike, the sun was already beginning to set. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay still. His hands gripped the handlebars tightly, his thoughts a storm inside his head. Keiji's words echoed in his mind. "When you decide, you know where to find me." He wasn't ready yet, but soon. The road stretched ahead, uncertain and open. For the first time in years, Hiroshi had no orders, no leader, no destination. And for the first time, he was okay with that. As Hiroshi rode, his mind drifted back to the last conversation he had with Kenta before things spiraled out of control. Kenta had once confided in him, years ago, that power was the only thing keeping them from being forgotten, that men like them had to carve out their place or be erased. Was that all there was? Or had they been chasing the wrong thing all along? The headlights of his bike cut through the darkness, the road stretching endlessly before him. A fork lay ahead, one path leading back to the world he knew, the other toward something unknown. He took a breath and made his choice. The Iron Wolves' hideout was silent. Not the usual silence of a late night after a long ride, but the heavy, suffocating kind that settled after failure. The gang had been fractured. Hiroshi had left. Keiji had bested them. And for the first time, Kenta felt something foreign gnawing at his chest. Doubt. He sat alone in the main hall, an empty bottle resting at his feet, his hand gripping another. The dim light flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows against the walls, twisting the once proud insignia of the Iron Wolves into something unrecognizable. The door creaked open, and Ryo stepped inside cautiously. He had seen Kenta angry before, but tonight was different. His leader wasn't shouting, wasn't breaking things in a fit of rage. Instead, he was just still. "Boss?" Ryo's voice was hesitant. Kenta didn't respond. Ryo glanced around before stepping forward. "The guys, they're waiting. They want to know what happens next." Kenta exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the glass bottle. He didn't know the answer. For the first time since forming the Iron Wolves, he didn't have a plan. Ryo shifted. "Hiroshi's gone," he said as if Kenta needed the reminder. "Some of the others. They're thinking about leaving too." Kenta's grip tightened. He had built this gang from nothing, had given these men purpose, had led them through fights, had carved a place for them in a world that had tossed them aside. And now it was slipping away. The bottle in his hand shattered. Rio flinched but didn't move. He had been around long enough to know when to step back and when to hold his ground. Kenta stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He turned to Rio, eyes burning. "They think they can just walk away?" Rio hesitated. Kenta grabbed the front of Rio's jacket, yanking him close. "Do they think we're just going to disappear? That Keiji can walk in here and tear down everything we built?" Rio swallowed hard. "No, boss. But things are different now." Kenta's hands trembled. He shoved Rio back, turning away. "Get out." Rio hesitated but then nodded, stepping out of the room. The moment the door closed, Kenta let out a slow breath. His fingers curled into fists, nails digging into his palms. His own men were doubting him. Hiroshi had abandoned him. And, worst of all, Keiji was right. The thought made his stomach churn. He needed a way to take back control. He needed to remind them all who he was. He needed Keiji gone. The following evening, Kenta stood at the edge of a cliffside road, his motorcycle idling beneath him. The sky was streaked with the dying embers of the sun, the horizon burning in hues of orange and red. He had sent a message to Keiji. A challenge. No more ambushes, no more games. A fight. One-on-one, and if Keiji had any honor, he would come. The wind howled through the canyon below, the distant echo of the world feeling far removed from the chaos in Kenta's mind. Then the sound of an approaching engine. Kenta didn't move. Keiji arrived exactly on time, his silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the setting sun. He cut the engine and dismounted, his movements deliberate. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Just Keiji, always steady, always sure. "You came," Kenta said. Keiji nodded. "You wanted a fight." Kenta exhaled, shaking his head. "This should have ended a long time ago." "It still can." Kenta's jaw clenched. "Not like that." Keiji studied him, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this." Kenta barked out a laugh, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong." He stepped forward, his stance firm. "No weapons, no backup, just us." Keiji didn't argue. The fight began. Kenta moved first, fast and brutal, swinging hard. Keiji deflected with ease, sidestepping as if he had predicted the move before it even began. Kenta's frustration mounted. Strike. Block. Counter. Kenta gritted his teeth. Keiji was faster, but Kenta had power. He just needed one clean hit. He feinted left, then swung low. Keiji twisted at the last second, but Kenta's fist clipped his ribs, sending him back a step. Finally. Kenta pressed forward, his attacks relentless. But Keiji remained composed, his movements precise, controlled. And then Keiji struck. A sharp blow to Kenta's shoulder sent him stumbling. The next hit landed clean against his chest, knocking the wind from his lungs. Kenta gasped, dropping to a knee. It was over. Keiji didn't move to finish him. He only stood there, watching, waiting. Kenta's breaths were ragged. He clenched his fists, staring at the dirt beneath him. His whole life had been built around the idea of power, of being feared, of never backing down. And now he was on his knees, defeated, just like that. Keiji finally spoke. "You have a choice." Kenta's head snapped up. Keiji's voice was steady. "You can keep fighting until there's nothing left, or you can stop. You don't have to lose everything." Kenta's teeth clenched so hard they hurt. "What do you know about losing?" Keiji's expression darkened. "More than you think?" Silence stretched between them. Kenta's fingers curled into the dirt. He could fight again. He could force himself to stand, could keep swinging until his body gave out. Or he could let go. The thought was unbearable. But so was the weight of everything crumbling around him. Keiji stepped back, giving him space. "It's your call." Kenta's breath came shakily. He looked out over the edge of the cliff, the vast sky stretching into the horizon. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The iron wolves were slipping away. His power was slipping away, and he had no idea what was left. The wind howled over the cliffside, carrying the weight of unspoken words. Kenta remained on his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands curled into the dirt. Keiji watched him, his expression unreadable, his posture steady but relaxed. There was no arrogance in his stance, no condescension in his gaze, only understanding. Kenta hated it. The fight was over. He had lost. The truth of it burned in his chest, threatening to choke him. His body ached, but it was nothing compared to the hollow sensation creeping through his core. He had spent his life building something unshakable, and now, in a matter of days, it had crumbled around him. Keiji finally broke the silence. "It doesn't have to end like this." Kenta barked out a laugh, bitter and sharp. "Then how should it end?" Keiji didn't answer immediately. He crouched a few feet away, resting his forearms on his knees. "That depends on you." Kenta shook his head. "I don't know who I am without this." His voice was quieter now, raw. Keiji studied him for a moment before speaking. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Kenta wanted to fight, wanted to deny it, to push Keiji away and hold on to the last scraps of what he had built. But the truth was, he had already lost. Not just this battle, but the war within himself. The iron wolves were fractured. Hiroshi was gone. And deep down, Kenta knew he had done this to himself. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to his feet. His body protested, muscles burning with the aftermath of the fight. Keiji stood as well, his movements smooth, effortless. For the first time, Kenta felt small. "I don't expect you to change overnight," Keiji said. "But this cycle, you know where it leads." Kenta turned away, staring out over the horizon. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon below. "I don't know how to be anything else," Kenta admitted, the words barely audible. Keiji didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was steady. "Then, start with not making things worse." Kenta exhaled sharply. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a rejection either. He turned back toward his bike, his steps slow, deliberate. He could feel Keiji watching him, waiting, expecting a final move, a decision. But Kenta had nothing left to give. Without another word, he mounted his bike, revved the engine, and rode off. Keiji didn't stop him. The iron wolves were quiet when Kenta returned. Most of them were still there, lingering in the hideout, waiting for a leader who no longer knew what he was leading them toward. Ryo was the first to approach, his expression cautious. "Well?" he asked. Kenta removed his helmet slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle in his chest. "We're done," he said. The words tasted foreign, bitter. Ryo frowned. "What do you mean?" Kenta turned to face him, his shoulders squared despite the exhaustion dragging at him. "It's over. No more fights, no more wars." His voice hardened. "No more iron wolves." A murmur rippled through the room. Confusion, disbelief. "What are we supposed to do now?" someone asked from the back. Kenta didn't have an answer. For years he had been the one with the plan, the vision. Now, standing in front of the men he had once commanded, he had nothing. "You figure it out," he said finally. The words carried finality. Ryo clenched his jaw. He had been with Kenta the longest, had followed him through victories and failures alike, and yet he didn't argue, didn't try to hold on to something that was already slipping away. One by one, the men began to leave. Some hesitated. Others walked away without a glance back. Kenta watched them go, the weight in his chest pressing heavier with each departing figure. Rio lingered. "What about you?" he asked quietly. Kenta let out a breath. "I don't know." It was the truth. Rio nodded as if he understood. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Kenta standing alone in the remains of what he had built. The Iron Wolves were no more, and Kenta was no longer their leader. For the first time in his life, he was just a man. And Keiji stood at the edge of the village watching the sun dip below the mountains. The air was still, heavy with the remnants of a long-fought war. Haru approached cautiously, his small frame tense. "Do you think he'll come back?" Keiji considered the question before answering. "Maybe." Haru frowned. "And if he does?" Keiji glanced down at the boy. "Then we see who he's become." Haru seemed to accept that answer, though his brow remained furrowed. The village was safe, for now. The threat that had loomed over them for weeks had passed, and yet Keiji knew that peace was never permanent. The world moved in cycles, but for the first time, it felt like this one had finally broken. He turned away from the setting sun, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, the war was over. Kenta rode for hours, his bike cutting through the empty roads like a ghost. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. He just needed to move, to put distance between himself and everything that had crumbled at his feet. At some point, he pulled into a roadside diner, the kind of place he wouldn't have glanced at before. Now it was just a place to stop, to breathe. He sat at the counter, ignoring the curious stares from the few patrons inside. The waitress poured him a coffee without a word. He stared at it. For years he had been surrounded by people, his gang, his men. His world had been built on noise and motion. Now there was only silence. He took a slow sip, the heat grounding him. For the first time, he wondered what came next. Not revenge, not war, just something else. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Kenta wasn't afraid of it. The village had changed. Keiji could see it in the way people carried themselves, in the way they spoke, in the way their eyes no longer darted nervously at every sound. The fear that had once gripped them had loosened, replaced by something steadier. Resolve. The Iron Wolves were gone. Kenta had left. But Keiji knew the danger wasn't over. A village couldn't simply erase fear overnight. Strength wasn't built in a single victory. It was built in what came after. And what came after was preparation. The morning after Kenta's departure, Keiji gathered the villagers in the town square. There was no urgency, no immediate crisis. But he had learned that the best time to prepare was before the storm came. Daichi, the village elder, stood beside him, his expression calm but expectant. Haru was there too, standing in front, his small hands clenched into fists. The boy had become a symbol of what the village had gained, a reason to fight, a future worth protecting. Keiji's gaze swept over the gathered faces. He had spent weeks here, yet he still felt like an outsider, and perhaps he always would. But that didn't change what needed to be done. "We stood together against the Iron Wolves," Keiji began, his voice steady. "You fought. You defended your home. But a single victory doesn't guarantee peace. We have to be ready for what comes next." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged uncertain glances. "What if Kenta comes back?" someone asked. Keiji didn't hesitate. "Then you'll be ready." Daichi stepped forward, his aged eyes steady. "What are you suggesting?" Keiji crossed his arms. "A proper defense. Trained fighters, not just men, but everyone willing to learn." More murmurs, some skeptical, some intrigued. One of the younger men, Jiro, frowned. "We're farmers, shopkeepers. We're not warriors." Keiji met his gaze. You weren't fighters before, but when the time came, you stood. That means you can fight." Jiro hesitated. Keiji sighed. "I'm not asking you to become soldiers. I'm asking you to be prepared." Silence stretched. Then, to Keiji's mild surprise, Daichi nodded. "He's right." The elder turned to the villagers. "We've lived in peace for a long time, but peace doesn't last unless it's protected. The world is changing. We must change too." That seemed to settle it. Keiji saw it in their eyes, the shift. It wasn't easy, but the first step never was. Training began that afternoon. Keiji took them back to the open field, the same place where their first lessons had begun. But this time, it was different. This time, they weren't training out of fear. They were training out of choice. The men learned first: stance, movement, precision over power. Many still struggled, but their determination was different now. There was no hesitation, no doubt. Then, to Keiji's surprise, the women joined in. They weren't warriors, but they were willing. And willingness was everything. Even the elder villagers watched closely, their skepticism gradually fading. Keiji gave them what they needed. Not just skill, but confidence. It wasn't about winning battles. It was about knowing they could. And then there was Haru. The boy trained harder than anyone. He mimicked Keiji's movements with a sharp, unwavering focus. His small frame was fast, his mind sharper than most adults. Keiji corrected his form but never coddled him. Haru didn't need coddling. He needed guidance. The days stretched into weeks. The training became routine. The village became stronger. Keiji knew the world wouldn't leave them alone forever. But now, they were ready. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daichi approached Keiji at the edge of the field. "You've given them something they didn't know they needed," the elder said. Keiji shrugged. "They did all the work." Daichi chuckled. "Maybe, but they wouldn't have started without you." Keiji remained silent. He wasn't good with gratitude. He didn't need it. The elder's expression grew thoughtful. "What will you do now?" Keiji exhaled slowly. "I haven't decided." "You could stay." Keiji glanced at him. He had expected the offer, but it still caught him off guard. "This isn't my home." Daichi nodded. "Perhaps not, but it's a place where you're needed." Keiji didn't respond. The world outside this village was still vast, still full of unfinished battles. But for the first time in years, he hesitated. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to keep running. That night, Haru found him sitting outside watching the stars. The boy plopped down beside him, silent for a while. Then, "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" Keiji glanced at him. "I haven't decided." Haru frowned. "You don't have to go." Keiji sighed. "It's not that simple." Haru thought for a moment. "Are you looking for something?" Keiji hesitated. "Maybe." The boy crossed his arms. "Then what if you already found it?" Keiji looked at him, surprised. Haru wasn't wrong. He had spent years searching for something, a purpose, a reason, a place to belong. Had he found it here? The thought unsettled him. Haru grinned suddenly. "If you stay, I'll let you be my sensei." Keiji snorted. "I never agreed to that." "You're still teaching me." Keiji rolled his eyes. "That's different." Haru smirked. "Doesn't seem different." Keiji sighed. The kid was sharp. Too sharp? And yet Keiji found himself smiling. Just a little. The village was strong now. It didn't need him anymore. But maybe, just maybe, he needed it. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a wandering ghost. Maybe it was time to stop running. Just for a little while. The village had settled into a rhythm, one built on resilience rather than fear. The iron wolves were gone, but Keiji knew that peace was fragile. The world outside was still wild, full of dangers that did not simply disappear overnight, and some dangers didn't come from the outside. Some came from within. It started with whispers. Haru was the first to notice. "Something's wrong," he said one morning as he trained with Keiji. Keiji frowned. "What do you mean?" Haru hesitated. "I heard some villagers talking. They're worried." Keiji had expected that. Fear didn't vanish so easily, but there was something in Haru's voice that made him pause. "What are they worried about?" Keiji asked. Haru swallowed. "You." Keiji didn't react immediately. He had always been an outsider here, despite everything, but he had thought maybe things were different now. "They say you brought the war here," Haru continued, "that if you weren't here, Kenta wouldn't have come." Keiji exhaled slowly. "And what do you think?" Haru's fists clenched. "I think they're wrong. You saved us." Keiji placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's not that simple." Haru scowled. "But you didn't do anything wrong." Keiji shook his head. "Sometimes that doesn't matter." Haru looked away, frustrated. Keiji had seen this before. People wanted peace, but they feared the things that had brought them that peace. It was easier to blame a man than to accept that the world had dangers they couldn't control. But it wasn't the whispers that bothered him most. It was the feeling, a presence, lingering in the shadows. He wasn't sure when he first noticed it. Maybe it had always been there, waiting for the right moment. A pair of unseen eyes watching him from the edge of the village, from the dark alleys at night. Keiji wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but he knew when he was being hunted, and something, or someone, was hunting him. That night, Keiji didn't sleep. He sat on the rooftop of one of the village homes, his senses sharp, his body still as the wind moved through the trees. He had spent years surviving by being aware of his surroundings, and right now, everything inside him was telling him that something was coming. The village was quiet, too quiet. Then a flicker of movement, a shadow near the tree line. Keiji narrowed his eyes. Whoever it was, they were good. Careful, but not careful enough. He moved without a sound, leaping from the rooftop and landing silently on the ground below. He followed the shadow, keeping his distance, waiting for an opening. The figure slipped through the village outskirts, stopping at the edge of the woods. Keiji saw the brief glint of steel beneath their cloak. A weapon. He struck. His footfalls were light, his approach seamless. Before the figure could react, he had them pinned against a tree, his blade pressed lightly against their throat. The hood fell away. A woman stared back at him, her eyes sharp and unreadable. "Who are you?" Keiji demanded. The woman didn't struggle. She simply smirked. "You're as fast as they say." Keiji's grip tightened. That wasn't an answer. The woman exhaled. "I'm not here to fight you." Keiji wasn't convinced. "Then why are you sneaking around my village with a weapon?" The woman's expression didn't change. "Because someone else is." Keiji's mind sharpened. "Explain." The woman nodded slightly. "I've been tracking a man for weeks. He came through this village once before. He's back." Keiji's grip loosened slightly. "Who?" The woman hesitated, then spoke a name Keiji hadn't heard in years. A name from his past. A name he had hoped to never hear again. And just like that, the past Keiji had tried to leave behind came rushing back. The woman's name was Mikasa. She was a tracker, a fighter, someone who had been searching for a man named Raiden. Keiji knew that name, and he knew what it meant. Raiden was a ghost from his past, a warrior from the same world Keiji had walked away from. If Raiden was here, it wasn't by accident. "Why are you after him?" Keiji asked. Mikasa's jaw tightened. "Because he's hunting you." Keiji absorbed that. He wasn't surprised. The past had a way of catching up to those who tried to outrun it. I need more than that, Keiji said. Mikasa crossed her arms. He's been moving through towns, looking for information on you. The moment he heard about the fight with Kenta, he knew where to find you. Keiji clenched his jaw. So that was it. The battle with the Iron Wolves had drawn more than just attention. It had drawn Raiden, and Raiden wasn't the kind of man to let things go. Keiji turned to Mikasa. Where is he now? Mikasa's eyes darkened. Close. Keiji didn't return to the village that night. Instead, he and Mikasa tracked Raiden's movements. They found his trail easily enough. He wasn't hiding. He wanted to be found. And by dawn, they found his camp. A lone fire burned, casting flickering shadows across the trees. And there, sitting by the fire, waiting, was Raiden. The years hadn't changed him much. His build was still powerful, his presence sharp as a drawn blade. When he looked up, there was no surprise in his expression, only recognition. It's been a long time, Keiji. Keiji didn't move. Not long enough. Raiden smirked. I figured you'd say that. Mikasa tensed beside Keiji. She had hunted this man, but now she saw the history between them. Keiji exhaled slowly. Why are you here? Raiden leaned forward, his smile widening. Because I'm not the only one looking for you. Keiji's gut tightened. What do you mean? Raiden chuckled. The fight with Kenta? That was just a spark. And you? You're the flame. Keiji's fingers curled into fists. He had fought to leave his past behind, to build something new. But if Raiden was right, then this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Keiji didn't flinch. The weight of Raiden's presence was something he had buried long ago. But now, staring at the man across the fire, it all came rushing back. Memories of war, of blood, of choices that had led him here. Raiden studied him, smirking as if he had already won. You look different, he mused. Less like the man I used to know. Keiji remained still. I walked away from that life. Raiden chuckled. Did you? Because from where I stand, you're still fighting. He gestured around. This little village, this war with Kenta, sounds to me like you're still the same. Keiji's fingers curled into fists. Why are you here? Raiden leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Because I was sent. Mikasa tensed beside Keiji. By who? Raiden smirked. Does it matter? He turned back to Keiji. The world hasn't forgotten you, old friend, and some people aren't happy about ghosts walking around where they don't belong. Keiji's gut tightened. He had enemies, but none he had crossed paths with in years. I don't play those games anymore. Raiden sighed dramatically. See, that's the problem. You think you get to choose. He stood slowly, stretching his shoulders. I've been patient, Keiji, but I didn't come all this way just to talk. Keiji exhaled. You're here to kill me. Raiden smiled. Not yet. That would be too easy. Mikasa moved first. She drew her blade in a flash, striking for Raiden's throat, but he was faster. He ducked, twisting his body, and struck out with his foot. Mikasa barely dodged, rolling to the side. Keiji was already moving. He lunged, his fist aiming for Raiden's ribs. Raiden blocked, his movements precise, almost playful. Still quick, Raiden said, grinning. Good. Keiji didn't answer. He pressed forward, his strikes fast and unrelenting. Raiden dodged, countering with sharp precision, forcing Keiji back. Mikasa came in again, her blade slicing through the air. Raiden twisted, catching her wrist and yanking her forward. She gasped as he slammed her into the ground. Keiji saw an opening. He struck, his fist landing squarely on Raiden's jaw. Raiden staggered, wiping his mouth. Then he laughed. Now that's more like it. He launched forward, his attacks ruthless. Keiji barely had time to react. A blow struck his ribs, another clipped his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, absorbing the pain. Raiden wasn't just strong. He was calculated. Keiji dodged a fatal strike, countering with a sharp elbow to Raiden's throat. The man stumbled, giving Keiji just enough space to regain his footing. Mikasa was up again, her blade ready. Blood trickled from her lip, but her stance was steady. Raiden exhaled. "I see you brought a friend. Cute." He rolled his shoulders. "This was fun, but I don't have time to waste." Keiji narrowed his eyes. "Then leave." Raiden chuckled. "Oh, I will, but not before I leave you with a little message." He reached into his coat and tossed something toward Keiji. Keiji caught it instinctively. His stomach dropped as he unwrapped the small cloth. Inside was a medallion, a symbol he knew too well. Mikasa inhaled sharply. The Black Lotus. Keiji's grip tightened. The Black Lotus was an assassination syndicate, one that Keiji had destroyed years ago, or so he had thought. Raiden grinned. "Looks like your past isn't done with you yet." And before either of them could react, Raiden vanished into the trees. The campfire crackled. Mikasa and Keiji remained still, the medallion heavy in his palm. Mikasa spoke first. "This isn't good." Keiji said nothing. She turned to him. "The Black Lotus was wiped out." Keiji's jaw tightened. "So we thought." Mikasa exhaled. "If they're back, they'll come for me." Silence stretched between them. Mikasa ran a hand through her hair. "I thought Raiden was just another ghost chasing you. But this? If the Black Lotus is involved, this isn't just about you. It's bigger." Keiji nodded. The Black Lotus wasn't just a threat. It was a storm. And if Raiden was working with them, then this was far from over. Mikasa met his gaze. "What do we do?" Keiji clenched his fist around the medallion. "We prepare." The village had always been quiet at dawn, but that morning, Keiji stood in the town square, watching the sky turn gold. Haru appeared beside him. "You didn't come back last night." Keiji glanced at the boy. "I had things to take care of." Haru frowned. "Is something wrong?" Keiji considered lying. But Haru deserved better. "Yes," he admitted. Haru's fists clenched. "Is it Kenta?" Keiji shook his head. "Something worse." Haru inhaled deeply. "Then we fight." Keiji studied the boy, surprised at his conviction. Haru had grown. He had lost his fear. Keiji placed a hand on his shoulder. "We train first." Haru nodded. "Then let's start." Mikasa watched as Keiji drilled the villagers harder than ever. The training that had once been to defend was now to survive. She approached him as the day stretched on. "Are you sure about this?" Keiji didn't pause. "They need to be ready." Mikasa crossed her arms. "You think the Black Lotus will come here?" Keiji met her gaze. "I know they will." She sighed. "Then I'm staying." Keiji raised an eyebrow. "You don't owe me anything." Mikasa smirked. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting Raiden dead." Keiji exhaled. "Then we stand together." Mikasa nodded. "Until the end." The moon rose over the village. Keiji stood at the outskirts, staring into the darkness beyond. He had spent his life fighting ghosts, running from them, destroying them. But now they were coming for him, and this time he wasn't running. He was waiting. The morning air was thick with tension. The village had sensed it. A storm was coming. Keiji knew that time was running out, but the real question was when the Black Lotus would strike. Haru stood beside him, watching as the villagers trained harder than ever. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled them. They moved with purpose. And yet, Keiji couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He turned to Haru. "Walk with me." The boy nodded and followed. They walked past the training fields, past the homes and the growing defenses. Haru's small frame was tense, his steps uncertain. "You've been different," Keiji observed. Haru glanced up at him. "I want to fight." Keiji exhaled. "I know. I mean really fight, not just train. I want to stand beside you when they come." Haru's hands clenched. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." Keiji studied him carefully. The boy had grown stronger, but strength alone wasn't enough. "Do you understand what that means?" Haru nodded. "It means I won't run." Keiji knelt, his gaze meeting the boy's. "It also means you have to be smart. Strength is good, but survival is better. If you want to help, you need to think." Haru's brow furrowed. "Then tell me what to do." Keiji rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're fast. You see things others don't. Use that. Be my eyes." Haru straightened. "A scout?" Keiji nodded. "A scout, and if something feels wrong, you come to me first. No reckless moves." Haru hesitated, then gave a firm nod. "I can do that." Keiji saw the determination in the boy's eyes. He wasn't just trying to prove himself. He wanted to protect what mattered. "Good," Keiji said. "Then let's begin." The village had a weak point. Keiji had known it for a while. The eastern path. It was narrow and surrounded by thick trees, the perfect place for an ambush. He had strengthened defenses there, but it still worried him. That's where Haru would scout. Keiji watched as the boy moved through the trees, quick and silent. He had taught him well. Haru knew when to move and when to stay hidden. Keiji stayed within range, keeping watch. Minutes passed. Then, a rustle in the distance. Keiji's eyes sharpened. Haru had frozen, his small body pressed against a tree. He wasn't moving. Keiji followed his gaze. Two figures, dressed in black, moving carefully through the forest. Too careful to be ordinary thieves. The Black Lotus. Haru's breathing was steady, but Keiji could sense his pulse racing. The boy was terrified, but he wasn't running. Keiji motioned for him to stay put. He circled the area, keeping low, moving behind the intruders. They were scouting, mapping the village, measuring its defenses. Keiji didn't hesitate. He struck. The first man barely had time to react before Keiji's blade sliced through the air, cutting his leg. He stumbled, eyes wide with shock. The second man lunged. Keiji sidestepped, driving an elbow into his ribs. The man grunted, swinging a dagger, fast but sloppy. Keiji caught his wrist, twisting it sharply. A sickening crack. The first man tried to run. A rock flew through the air, striking the man's temple. He collapsed. Keiji turned in surprise. Haru stood there, breathing hard, a second rock in his hand. Keiji exhaled. "Good throw." Haru swallowed. "You said to be your eyes." Keiji looked down at the fallen men. They were still alive. That meant answers. "Come," Keiji said. "We need to talk to them." The captured scout refused to speak. Keiji had expected as much. The second man, his wrist broken, had been more cooperative. Pain made people talk. "The Lotus is moving," the man had gritted out. "They know about you." Keiji had expected that too, but what he hadn't expected was when. "They're coming tonight." Keiji's blood ran cold. Mikasa cursed under her breath. "That soon?" Keiji turned to Haru. "You did well." The boy nodded, his face pale but steady. Mikasa crossed her arms. "If they're coming tonight, we don't have time to waste." Keiji nodded. The village had to be ready. The sun was setting when Keiji gathered the villagers. Their faces were tight with fear, but their hands were steady on their weapons. "We don't run," Keiji said firmly. "We don't hide. We defend." The villagers stood taller. Keiji turned to Haru. "You'll be stationed at the lookout. If anything changes, you come straight to me." Haru hesitated. "But I can fight." Keiji crouched to his level. "You already did. And tonight, your job is to keep us one step ahead." Haru inhaled deeply, then nodded. "Okay." Keiji rose. "Let's move." Night fell. Keiji stood at the village's entrance, Mikasa beside him. The air was too still. Then, a whistle. Haru's signal. Keiji's grip tightened. They were here. The Black Lotus had arrived, and the battle for the village was about to begin. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The village was quiet, unnaturally so. Every torch had been extinguished, and the only light came from the sliver of moon peeking through the clouds. Keiji stood at the village entrance, his muscles coiled like a spring. Mikasa was beside him, fingers resting lightly on the hilt of her blade. Haru was somewhere in the shadows above, watching. They had prepared, trenches dug, traps set, villagers armed, but would it be enough? Then the signal. A second whistle, short and sharp. Haru's warning. Mikasa tensed. "They're here." Keiji exhaled. "Hold the line." Silence stretched. Then, like shadows emerging from the void, they came. Figures in black poured from the tree line, moving with deadly precision. At least 20, maybe more. Ghosts in the moonlight. Keiji didn't wait. A flick of his wrist sent a kunai flying, burying itself in the throat of the first assassin. A heartbeat later, the first trap triggered. A pit beneath the entrance collapsed, swallowing 2 assassins onto sharpened stakes. Another was yanked skyward by a rope snare. Mikasa ended him in a single stroke. The Black Lotus hesitated. A mistake. The villagers struck. Spears thrust from barricades. Arrows rained down. Haru, perched high above, hurled flaming oil onto their flank, forcing them back. For the first time, the Black Lotus was on the defensive. Keiji darted through the chaos, slicing through one attacker before parrying another's strike. Beside him, Mikasa's blade moved like the wind. A flurry of movement. A Lotus assassin lunged. Keiji pivoted, grabbing the man's wrist and driving a knee into his ribs. The assassin gasped. Then Keiji twisted, flipping him into the mud. A quick strike ended it. Then, the shift. The Black Lotus wasn't retreating. They were reorganizing. A sudden flare of red, a signal. Keiji cursed. They're adapting. Mikasa wiped blood from her blade. Then we finish this before they do. Then, from the shadows, he stepped forward. A towering figure clad in dark armor, his face half hidden beneath a mask. Daigo. Keiji steadied himself. He knew that presence. Daigo wasn't just another assassin. He was one of the Lotus generals. And he was here for Keiji. Daigo tilted his head. I expected more. His voice was a low rumble. A village holding off the Black Lotus. He scoffed. You always did love impossible odds. Keiji rolled his shoulders. You talk too much. Daigo smirked. And you never learned when to bow. He drew his massive nodachi, the blade gleaming. You should have stayed dead. Then he charged. Keiji barely dodged before Daigo's blade came down, carving into the ground. Fast. Faster than someone his size should be. Keiji countered, striking for Daigo's exposed side. Blocked. Daigo twisted, his massive strength sending Keiji skidding backward. Mikasa moved to help. No! Keiji barked. He's mine! Mikasa hesitated, then turned to cut down another assassin. Keiji refocused. Daigo smirked. Still stubborn. Keiji exhaled. You always were too arrogant. They circled each other, the battle raging around them. Then, Daigo attacked. Keiji sidestepped, striking at Daigo's wrist. The larger man grunted, grip faltering. An opening. Keiji exploited it. A strike to the ribs, another to the knee. Daigo dropped. Keiji raised his blade for the final strike. A dagger flashed. Pain exploded in his side. Keiji staggered back, hand flying to the wound. Daigo had thrown a knife at close range. Keiji exhaled sharply. A distraction. Daigo was already on his feet, lunging. Keiji barely rolled away. Blood dripped onto the ground. Daigo grinned. Not as fast as you used to be. Keiji forced himself upright. Still faster than you. He shifted stance. Daigo came again. Keiji feinted, lowering his guard, baiting him. Daigo took it. Keiji struck. A blade to the knee. A twist of Daigo's wrist. A final, devastating strike to his throat. Daigo collapsed, choking. Keiji stood over him, blade raised. Daigo smirked and laughed. Finish it. Keiji hesitated. The Black Lotus never begged. Daigo locked eyes with him. You won't. That's why they sent me. He coughed, blood staining his lips. To remind you of what you are. Keiji's grip tightened. Then he lowered his blade. Daigo's smirk widened. Keiji turned away. The remaining Lotus forces retreated. They had lost their commander. The battle was over. But Keiji knew. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The village gathered, exhausted but victorious. Haru found Keiji. You're hurt. Keiji wiped the blood from his side. It's nothing. The boy frowned. You let him live. Keiji exhaled. I did. Haru hesitated. Why? Keiji looked at the battlefield. Because killing Daigo wouldn't stop the Black Lotus. Because he wasn't the enemy Keiji was truly fighting. Because sometimes mercy was more powerful than death. But he didn't say that. Instead, he turned to Haru. You did well. Haru's eyes shone with quiet pride. Keiji looked toward the horizon. He had won this battle. But the war was still coming. The embers of battle still glowed in the village, the scent of blood and smoke lingering in the air. The Black Lotus had retreated, but their presence had left a scar. The villagers worked in solemn silence, tending to the wounded, repairing what had been broken. The victory had come at a cost. Keiji stood on the outskirts, watching as the sun began to rise. His wound throbbed, but the pain was distant, overshadowed by the weight of his thoughts. Daigo's words still echoed in his mind. To remind you of what you are. What did that mean? That he was still one of them? That no matter how far he ran, his past would always catch up? He exhaled, shaking the thought away. There was no time for doubt. He turned his gaze toward the makeshift prison in the village square. Kenta sat there, bound, his head lowered, shadows hiding his expression. Mikasa approached. He's been silent since the battle. Keiji nodded. That won't last. She crossed her arms. What are you going to do with him? Keiji didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the captive. Kenta looked up as Keiji approached, his bruised face barely betraying emotion. His lip was split, his eye swollen, but there was something else. A flicker of something deeper. Keiji crouched. You had your chance to run. Kenta's jaw tightened. I wasn't going to run. Silence hung between them. Finally, Kenta exhaled. You should have killed me. Keiji studied him carefully. Would that have changed anything? Kenta's hands clenched into fists. They won't stop coming. His voice was bitter. You think you won? The Black Lotus doesn't stop. Keiji didn't flinch. Neither do I. Kenta scoffed but didn't reply. Keiji's voice softened. Tell me something. Why are you here? Kenta hesitated, but there was something in Keiji's tone. Not mockery, not arrogance. A genuine question. Why did you join the Lotus? Keiji pressed. Kenta exhaled sharply. What does it matter? Keiji sat down on a nearby crate, his posture relaxed. Because I was once where you are now. Kenta stiffened. He hadn't expected that. Keiji continued. I know how they work. I know how they find people like you, make you believe they're giving you a purpose. Kenta's gaze darkened. You think you know me? I know the choices they gave you weren't really choices at all. Kenta swallowed hard but said nothing. Keiji leaned forward. Tell me, who were you before them? The question struck something deep. Kenta looked away. No one. Keiji nodded slowly. And now? Kenta hesitated. Now. I don't know. Silence stretched again. Keiji stood looking down at him. You still have a choice, Kenta, but it's yours to make. Kenta laughed dryly. What choice? You think I can just walk away? You can. Keiji's tone was firm. You won't be the first, and you won't be the last. Kenta searched his face as if trying to find deception. When he found none, he looked down at his bound hands. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. The next morning, Kenta was unbound. Mikasa frowned. Are you sure about this? Keiji nodded. He's not a prisoner anymore. Kenta flexed his wrists, looking at Keiji. What now? Keiji met his gaze. That's up to you. The younger man exhaled. Then, for the first time since his capture, he bowed his head. Keiji nodded. Kenta's awakening had begun. The village was quiet in the days following the battle. The scent of blood had faded, replaced by the earthy aroma of wet soil and fresh timber as repairs continued. Despite the damage, life had not stopped. If anything, the people worked harder, driven by a newfound determination. Keiji watched from a distance as men and women patched rooftops, reinforced wooden barriers, and tilled the fields as though preparing for another storm. Even the children, usually playful and carefree, carried small buckets of water to aid in the rebuilding. Among them, Kenta stood awkwardly near a group of villagers hammering wooden planks into a collapsed wall. His hands twitched at his sides, unused to the idea of working with, rather than against, the people around him. Keiji stepped up beside him. You plan to just stand there? Kenta flinched but recovered quickly, scowling. I don't exactly know what I'm supposed to do. Keiji gestured toward a pile of heavy logs. Start by lifting. Kenta hesitated, but eventually stepped forward. He grunted as he hoisted one of the logs onto his shoulder, following the villagers as they carried supplies to the damaged areas. As the morning wore on, the skepticism in the villagers' gazes softened. Kenta worked hard, silent but efficient, his strength making him a valuable addition. Haru, watching from the side, leaned toward Keiji. You really think he'll stay? Keiji exhaled. I think he's trying to figure that out himself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the village gathered for a modest meal. Though the air carried remnants of tension, there was a strange sense of unity in the way they shared their food, their laughter hesitant but genuine. Kenta sat at the edge of the gathering, eating in silence. Across from him, a woman glanced his way before pushing a bowl of rice toward him. He blinked at the gesture but accepted it with a nod. Keiji, sitting a few feet away, smirked. Looks like they're warming up to you. Kenta scoffed. I don't see why. People here believe in action more than words. You worked alongside them today. That counts for something. Kenta stared at his bowl. And if I leave? Keiji met his gaze. Then that's your choice. Kenta exhaled sharply. You keep saying that, but what does it even mean? Choice? There's nothing for me outside of the lotus. That's all I've ever known. Keiji placed his cup down. Then why are you still here? Kenta had no answer. Over the following days, the village began to feel less like a prison and more like something Kenta couldn't define. Each morning, he woke before dawn, helping with repairs, moving supplies, and even assisting with patrols along the outskirts. The villagers no longer avoided him, and though they still eyed him warily, some had started greeting him. One night, as Keiji sharpened his blade near a small fire, Kenta sat down beside him. Silence stretched between them before Kenta finally spoke. "I don't know how to do anything else," he admitted, staring at the flames. "Fighting, following orders, hurting people, it's all I've ever done." Keiji continued sharpening his blade. "That's not all you are." Kenta let out a dry chuckle. "You sound like you actually believe that." Keiji set his blade down. "I do." He turned to Kenta. "You think I don't know what it's like? To believe you're only capable of destruction? That the only thing keeping you alive is the fight?" Kenta hesitated. "And?" Keiji looked toward the village. "And I learned that survival isn't the same as living." Kenta frowned. "And what? You think I can just change?" Keiji shrugged. "It's not about changing overnight. It's about choosing, every day, to be better than the person you were yesterday." Kenta stared at the fire, deep in thought. "And if I fail?" Keiji smirked. "Then you try again." For the first time in a long time, Kenta felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The days turned to weeks. The village continued to heal, its people growing stronger, their trust in one another deepening. Kenta found himself included. He worked alongside the villagers without feeling like an outsider. He sparred with the younger men, not as an enemy, but as a mentor. He even found himself speaking with Haru, answering the boys' endless questions about fighting techniques. One evening, as they patrolled the outskirts together, Kenta glanced at Keiji. "I don't think I can ever make up for what I've done." Keiji exhaled. "That's not the point." Kenta frowned. "Then what is?" Keiji looked at him. "Making sure your past doesn't define your future." Kenta was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I think I'd like to stay." Keiji smirked. "I figured." For the first time in his life, Kenta felt something foreign, a sense of belonging, a new beginning. The first light of dawn stretched over the village, casting long shadows as the morning mist curled around the wooden houses. The air carried the scent of freshly tilled earth, and the distant sound of hammering echoed through the quiet streets. Life had settled into a fragile peace. Keiji stood at the village outskirts, his pack slung over one shoulder, his sword resting at his hip. His eyes followed the gentle movements of the villagers, mothers tending to children, farmers inspecting their crops, and warriors training with renewed purpose. It was a sight he would not forget. The battle had been won, but Keiji knew that peace was never permanent. It was a fleeting thing, something that had to be cultivated and protected. And though this village had come a long way, its fate no longer rested in his hands. A faint breeze carried the scent of burning wood from the blacksmith's forge. Somewhere in the distance, laughter rang out as children chased each other through the fields. The village was alive. Haru's hurried footsteps disrupted his thoughts. The boy ran toward him, stopping just short of crashing into him. His face was flushed, his breathing quick. "You're really leaving?" Keiji nodded. "It's time." "But why?" Haru's fists clenched at his sides. "You don't have to go. The village needs you. I need you." Keiji crouched so they were eye level. "Haru, you don't need me to protect you anymore." The boy's lip trembled. "But I still have so much to learn." Keiji smiled. "And you will. You have good people here. Mikasa, Kenta, the villagers. They'll teach you what I can't." Haru looked down. "I just thought, maybe you could stay." Keiji reached into his cloak and pulled out a small polished kunai. He flipped it in his fingers before handing it to Haru. "Then, take this." Haru hesitated before taking the weapon carefully. "What's this for?" Keiji placed a hand on his shoulder. A reminder. That strength is not just in the blade, but in the heart of the one who wields it. Haru nodded, gripping the kunai tightly. I won't forget. Keiji exhaled. I know. Kenta approached next, his usual arrogance subdued. He had shed his Black Lotus past like a second skin, replacing his old armor with the simple, practical garb of a villager. He had earned their trust, not fully, but enough. You're really leaving, Kenta muttered. Keiji nodded. I don't belong here. Kenta scoffed. That's debatable. Keiji smirked. You'll take care of things here, won't you? Kenta hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I will. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Keiji offered his hand. Kenta took it. You've come a long way, Keiji admitted. Kenta smirked. Yeah, well, I had a good teacher. Keiji arched a brow. I wasn't trying to teach you anything. Kenta shrugged. And yet, here I am. Mikasa leaned against the gate, arms crossed. I knew this day was coming. Keiji tilted his head. You sound disappointed. She let out a dry chuckle. More like annoyed. We could have used you. You don't need me, Keiji said. Mikasa studied him for a long moment. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you have to go. Keiji glanced at the village. I'm not the kind of man who stays in one place. She sighed, rubbing her forehead. You're a stubborn one, you know that? Keiji chuckled. I've heard that before. A rare moment of understanding passed between them. No grand goodbyes, no sentimentality, just mutual respect. As Keiji turned to leave, the villagers gathered, standing in quiet reverence. He had asked for nothing, and yet they gave him everything. A place among them, even if only for a time. Haru suddenly ran forward and thrust something into Keiji's hand. Here. Keiji looked down. A small, hand-carved wooden emblem, the symbol of the village. His throat tightened. He clenched his fingers around it, then tucked it into his cloak. Thank you. Haru wiped at his eyes. You'll come back, right? Keiji hesitated before answering. Maybe one day. Haru swallowed hard and nodded. I'll be stronger when you do. Keiji ruffled his hair. I don't doubt it. And with that, he walked away, his silhouette fading into the rising sun. The village had changed, and so had he. Keiji walked alone beneath the dense canopy of the ancient forest, his footsteps nearly silent on the moss-covered path. The scent of damp earth filled the air, and the occasional rustle of leaves signaled the movement of unseen creatures nearby. The village was now miles behind him, but its presence still lingered in his thoughts. He had spent so much time there, fought battles, forged bonds, and, perhaps, for the first time in years, felt something close to peace. But peace was fleeting. It always had been. His journey stretched before him like an unmarked road, endless and uncertain. He had no fixed destination, only the understanding that his path had not yet reached its conclusion. The world was vast, and it was never short of men who abused their strength, of tyrants who wielded power without purpose. He had seen it too many times to ignore. He reached a clearing where a small stream cut through the earth like a silver ribbon, its surface reflecting the dim light filtering through the trees. Keiji knelt by the water, cupping his hands to take a drink. As the ripples settled, he caught sight of his own reflection staring back at him, a face lined with scars, eyes shadowed with the weight of countless battles. He had always been a warrior. But what was he now? A protector? A drifter? A relic of an era that had no place in the world he was trying to shape? His fingers tightened around the wooden emblem Haru had given him, still tucked into his cloak. It was smooth and light in his palm, yet its weight felt immeasurable. He had accepted it without words, yet deep down he understood what it meant. It was a reminder, a tether to something real. The boy had changed because of him, had chosen a path of growth rather than destruction. Perhaps, in some small way, Keiji had changed as well. He let out a slow breath, settling onto the grass beside the stream. The journey had transformed him, but it had not given him all the answers. He had spent years perfecting the art of battle, learning how to kill with precision and efficiency. Yet the lessons that mattered most had not come from the battlefield. They had come from the quiet moments, from the trust he had built with the villagers, from the hesitant steps of Kenta as he tried to rebuild his life, from the unwavering gaze of a boy who had believed in something greater than vengeance. For so long, Keiji had believed that strength was defined by victory, but he had learned something else. True strength lay in knowing when to fight and when to let go. Power without purpose was meaningless, just as war without end was nothing but destruction. The wind stirred the trees, whispering through the branches, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and distant rain. The forest around him was alive, not just with creatures but with its own quiet wisdom. It had stood for centuries, watched over the shifting tides of time, and yet it had never wavered in its purpose. Keiji envied that certainty. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small folded piece of cloth. Inside was an old token from his past, a relic of his time with the Black Lotus, a symbol he had carried for years, long after he had abandoned them. He stared at it for a long time before standing and walking back to the stream. Without hesitation, he let it fall from his fingers, watching as the current carried it away. It was time to let go. He exhaled, feeling lighter somehow, as though the weight of his past had lessened just a bit. He would never erase the things he had done, but he could choose to shape what came next. The forest around him felt alive with whispers, not of ghosts, but of possibility. He adjusted the straps of his pack and turned away from the stream. The road stretched ahead, winding through the trees, disappearing into the horizon. He did not know where it would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would keep moving forward. The journey was far from over. The village had changed, and so had Kenta. In the weeks following Keiji's departure, he found himself standing in places he had once overlooked. Inside the forge, assisting with repairs. In the fields, tending to crops he once would have ignored. Among the villagers, listening instead of commanding. It was a life unfamiliar to him, yet, strangely, it did not feel wrong. Kenta had spent years under the banner of the Black Lotus, living by their code, taking orders without question. Strength was all that had mattered then. Respect was earned through fear, survival ensured by violence. But here, in the village that had once seen him as an enemy, he was beginning to understand something different. Respect was not demanded. It was given, earned through action, through sincerity. It was not easy. Some villagers still eyed him warily, their trust fragile, their memories of the past too fresh to be forgotten. He did not blame them. Redemption was not won overnight, nor was it something that could be forced. He had to prove himself, not through words, but through effort. One morning, Kenta stood at the edge of the village square, watching a group of young boys training with wooden swords. Their movements were clumsy, their forms sloppy, but their eyes were filled with determination. Haru, standing at the center, demonstrated a sequence of strikes, his stance mirroring Keiji's fluid precision. A man beside Kenta, an older farmer with rough hands and tired eyes, spoke without looking at him. "Strange, seeing you here like this?" Kenta turned to him. "You still don't trust me?" The man shrugged. "Maybe not, but I see what you're trying to do." He crossed his arms. "You stay long enough, maybe trust will come." Kenta nodded. It was the most he could ask for. As the training session ended, Haru ran up to him. "They're getting better," the boy said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Still sloppy, though." Kenta smirked. "That's because they need a real teacher." Haru's eyes brightened. "You mean?" Kenta sighed. Yeah, all right, I'll help train them. Haru beamed. Wait until everyone hears this. Kenta watched as the boy ran off, excitement in his steps. He had never been a teacher before, but maybe, just maybe, this was something he could do. Days turned to weeks, and Kenta continued to carve out his place among the villagers. He worked alongside them, trained with them, and, to his surprise, even laughed with them. He was no longer an outsider, not entirely. One evening, as he sat by the village gates, staring at the stars, Mikasa approached. She leaned against the wooden post beside him, arms crossed. "Didn't think you'd last this long," she admitted. Kenta chuckled. "Neither did I." She studied him for a moment. "You ever think about leaving?" Kenta exhaled. "I did, at first. Thought I didn't belong here. And now?" He glanced at the village behind him, the warm glow of lanterns, the distant laughter of children. "Now, I think this is where I'm supposed to be." Mikasa smirked. "Guess we'll see if the village agrees." Kenta smirked back. "Guess we will." One day, an unexpected visitor arrived at the village gates. A young man, barely older than Haru, bearing the mark of the black lotus on his arm. He was injured, exhausted, fear flickering in his eyes. They came after me," the young man gasped, collapsing to his knees. "I left the lotus. I didn't want to, but they don't let you leave." Kenta knelt beside him, steadying him. "You're safe here." The boy looked at him in shock. "But you were one of them." "Not anymore." The boy trembled. Then, "Can I stay?" Kenta exhaled. "We'll figure it out." For the first time, he understood. Redemption was not just for himself. It was something he could offer to others. And he would. The name of the mysterious warrior had begun to spread beyond the village, whispered in distant towns and among traveling merchants. Tales of the faceless ninja who had defeated the Black Lotus, who had protected the innocent without asking for anything in return, had taken on a life of their own. At first, it was just a few travelers who had heard the story, but soon it was spoken in hushed tones in tea-houses and markets, growing with each retelling. "Did you hear about the warrior in the mountains?" a merchant would ask. "They say he fought off an entire gang with nothing but his bare hands," another would reply. "Bare hands? I heard he could vanish like a ghost and reappear before his enemies even realized they were dead." The stories became wilder with each passing day. In a bustling city far from the quiet village, a group of wandering swordsmen sat around a fire in a crowded inn. One of them, a veteran with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward, lowering his voice as if speaking of a ghost. "They say he wears no emblem, swears no allegiance. He is not a samurai, not a bandit, not a lord, just a shadow." Another swordsman, younger and full of bravado, scoffed. "A myth, a story to keep thieves awake at night." But the scarred man shook his head. "I met a merchant who passed through a village in the mountains. He swears he saw a warrior defeat an entire gang of Black Lotus riders alone. Not a single man dared to challenge him after that." The younger man hesitated. If even half the stories were true, this Keiji was someone to be feared. Further north, in a quiet temple nestled between the hills, a monk swept the stone steps as a weary traveler approached. The monk paused, recognizing the emblem on the traveler's cloak, one of a wandering scholar. "You have come a long way," the monk said, offering the man a cup of tea. "What brings you to these mountains?" The scholar took a slow sip before answering. "I am chasing stories." He set his cup down. "Have you heard of the nameless warrior who moves like the wind?" The monk smiled. "Ah, the phantom swordsman, the protector of the weak. Some say he is a fallen samurai seeking redemption. Others say he is the last of a forgotten clan." He placed his hands together in thought. "Legends have a way of shaping the world." "And what do you believe?" the scholar asked. The monk looked toward the distant mountains. I believe the man exists, but what he has done, what he will do, only time will tell." Meanwhile, in the village, life moved on. Kenta had taken on his new role as protector, and Haru trained harder than ever, inspired by the memory of the man who had saved them all. One evening, as Kenta sat sharpening his sword by the fire, an old traveler arrived at the village gates. The man, bent with age but sharp in his eyes, asked for a place to rest. As he warmed his hands, he spoke. "I have traveled far," the old man began, "and in every town I have heard the same name." He looked around at the villagers. "Keiji." Haru's head snapped up. "You know about Keiji?" The old man chuckled. "Know about him? Boy, I have heard things you wouldn't believe." The villagers gathered closer, eager to hear more. "They say he walks like a shadow, unseen yet ever present," the traveler continued. "That he does not kill unless he must, but when he does, not even the wind can catch him." Kenta smirked. "Sounds like they're exaggerating." The traveler shrugged. "Perhaps, but legends always start from truth." He leaned forward. "And if the truth is strong enough, even the mountains will remember his name." Haru grinned. "That means he's still out there." The old man nodded. "A warrior like him doesn't disappear. He simply becomes the wind." The fire crackled as the villagers sat in silence, thinking of the man who had changed their lives. Keiji had left, but his presence remained, and his legend was only beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills. A lone figure walked the narrow mountain path, his steps steady, his presence quiet. Keiji moved like the wind, unseen yet ever present, his journey stretching endlessly before him. Far behind him, the village he had once protected thrived. The people had moved forward, carrying the lessons he had left them. Kenta had stepped into a new role, no longer a man of violence but of strength and purpose. Haru trained with unwavering determination, each strike of his wooden sword echoing the teachings of the one who had saved them. Keiji glanced up at the sky, watching the last light of day slip behind the mountains. He had no destination, no final goal. He was not a samurai sworn to a master, nor a rogue seeking vengeance. He was something else, a guardian of balance, a reminder that power could serve more than destruction. As he walked, his mind drifted back to the village, to the people he had left behind. He had taught them survival, but they had taught him something greater. For so long, he had lived as a ghost, an echo of a past he could never escape. But in their eyes, he had seen something different, a future, a choice. He passed through quiet forests, through valleys where the morning mist clung to the earth like a veil. He saw villages much like the one he had protected, their people living in fear of those who would take without conscience. He felt the weight of injustice in the air, the same weight he had carried for years. But now he carried something else too, hope. As the wind shifted, carrying the distant sounds of a town ahead, Keiji exhaled. He adjusted the straps of his pack, knowing another story was waiting to unfold. His journey was not over. It never would be. In the village, the echoes of Keiji's presence remained, woven into the very fabric of their daily lives. Kenta had taken responsibility for the people he once terrorized, dedicating himself to their safety. He had rebuilt what had been broken, not just with his hands, but with his actions. One evening, as the villagers gathered in the square, Kenta addressed them. "For too long, I was blinded by power. I took from you, I hurt you, and yet you still gave me a chance to be better." He looked around, meeting their eyes one by one. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I will earn it." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some still held doubts, but others, those who had seen him working alongside them, defending them, nodded in quiet acceptance. Nearby, Haru, no longer just an eager boy with a wooden sword, stood atop the village's training platform. The other children watched as he demonstrated a series of strikes, his movements fluid, precise. "Again," Haru commanded, his voice steady. The students obeyed, their wooden swords moving in unison. Their discipline and focus reflected the teachings Keiji had left behind. Kenta stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with quiet approval. The boy had grown, not just in skill, but in spirit. Mikasa approached Kenta, standing beside him. "He's becoming something else, isn't he?" Kenta nodded. "He's becoming his own legend." Mikasa smirked. "Reminds me of someone." Kenta chuckled. "Yeah, but this time, it's different." The village had changed, but more than that, it had learned to stand on its own. The wind rustled the trees, carrying whispers of old battles, of lives once lost, of debts repaid in lessons and not in blood. As the night settled in, an elderly man sat near the fire and spoke to the younger villagers. "Let me tell you the tale of the faceless warrior," he began, "a man who came like the storm and left like the wind." Children sat cross-legged, listening with wide eyes. The legend had already begun to take on a life of its own. In the morning, Haru visited the village shrine, standing before the stone monument where past warriors were honored. He placed his wooden sword at its base, bowing his head. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." He stepped back, a determination in his eyes. "One day I will walk the same path," he promised. "And I won't just follow your steps, I will make my own." Kenta watched from a distance, his arms crossed, a small smirk on his face. He could see the same fire in Haru's eyes that had once burned in his own. But Haru's path was different, stronger, purer. That night, as the stars blinked overhead, Kenta sat outside his home, staring at the sky. Mikasa joined him, setting a cup of tea beside him. "Still thinking about him?" she asked. Kenta nodded. "It's strange. I spent so long chasing power. And now, the one person who truly understood it has vanished like a ghost." Mikasa smiled. "He didn't vanish, Kenta. He became something greater, and so did we." Kenta exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, we did." Far beyond the hills, Keiji approached the outskirts of a small village nestled between the trees. Lanterns flickered in the distance, shadows moving behind the paper screens. The town was quiet, but the air carried something familiar, tension. He stepped into the main road, passing by a cluster of merchants whispering among themselves. "They came last night," one of them muttered. "Took what they wanted, like they owned the place." Keiji paused, listening. Another village, another struggle. He adjusted the grip on the pack slung over his shoulder. He had been here before, in many places like this. The world was full of battles that had not yet been fought, injustices that had yet to be corrected, a purpose that had not yet been fulfilled. Keiji took one last look at the lantern swaying in the breeze. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. The wind carried his silhouette into the night, his legend continuing in the whispers of those who would remember. A cycle restored, a legend reborn. And the journey would never end.